Right, so we're at chapter 2. We're going to be looking for what's going to happen to Winston. That's what we're after. So remember, he's in the cell. That dude's been torn away from the cell. Yeah. That guy's been torn away from the cell. And he's tried blaming other people, including the guy who tried giving him bread and got him into trouble. But the guards paid no attention and dragged him away anyway. 90 pages to go. We're doing it today. We're finishing now. This should be the last one. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. I am smoking for a moment, by the way. That's what I'm doing. If for any other reason, more so to waste time for 5 minutes. But I'm expecting we're going to finish now. This should be interesting. What is it, Stardog or something? Ugh. Not the best. Not the worst. He was lying. On something that felt like a camp bed, except that it was higher off the ground and that he was fixed down in some way so that he could not move. Right, who was he? Let's just go back a sec. Oof. Doo-doo-doo. Nothing in the world is so bad as physical pain. In the face of pain, and no heroes, he thought everyone over arrived on the floor. This is Winston starving on the floor, right? Oh, that's right. O'Brien showed up to the room. Oh, no, I forgot about that. O'Brien's in the room. And he said he's already caught him. But he's a thought police man. All the eyes on the truncheon and the guards aren't about anywhere. Sometimes needs. Okay, so it is Winston on the floor. Got ya, got ya, got ya. He was lying on something that felt like a camp bed, except on the ground. It's higher, fixed down instantly, did not move. Back where we was. It seemed that light that seemed stronger than usual was falling on his face. O'Brien was standing at his side, looking down at him intently. At the other side of him stood a man in a white coat, holding a hypodermic syringe. Alright. Getting a bit serious. Oops, sorry. And I'm not letting my hot chocolate go cold. God, those cups are so stupid. Even after his eyes were open, he took in his surroundings, only gradually. He had the impression of swimming up into the room from some quite different world, a sort of underwater world far beneath it. He's been having dreams about people drowning, remember? So maybe that's connected. Especially with his, I think it's his wife underwater. How long it had been down there, he had been down there, he did not know. Since that moment when they arrested him, he had not seen darkness or daylight. Besides, his memories were not continuous. There had been times when consciousness, even the sort of consciousness that one has in sleep, has stopped dead and started again after a blank interval. But whether the intervals were days or weeks, or only seconds, there was no way of knowing. With that, the first blow on the elbow, the nightmare had started. If you're ever caught in one of those situations, you don't know what time it is, do yourself a favour. Very quickly, mark your skin with like a nail or something like that. And then as time goes by, you'll find it scabbing, you'll find it doing stuff. You can kind of keep track of time doing it that way. So do that, because blood takes a certain amount of time to dry. So if you say, You slightly graze yourself, you can bleed, and if you do black out and come back and it's still bleeding, it must have been a couple of minutes. That's it. Now, if you pass out and it's scabbed over, you know it's been a little bit longer than that. Does that make sense? Do that in the future. That'll help you. Later, he was to realise that all that then happened was merely a preliminary, a routine interrogation to which nearly all prisoners were subjected. There was a long range of crimes, espionage, sabotage, and the like, to which everyone had to confess as a matter of course. Well, you see, I was expecting a super long list, and I started strong, and then you just stopped with and the like. Well, thank you very much. The confession was a formality, though the torture was real. How many times he had been beaten, how long the beatings had continued, he could not remember. Always there were 5 or 6 men in black uniforms at him simultaneously. Sometimes it was fists, sometimes it was truncheons, sometimes it was steel rods, sometimes it was boots. There were times when he rolled about the floor as shameless as an animal, writhing his body this way and that in an endless, hopeless effort to dodge the kicks, and simply inviting more and yet more kicks in his ribs, in his belly, in his elbows, on his shins, in his groin, in his testicle. Told you, there's fucking lists everywhere. On the bone at the base of his spine. There were times when it went on and on until the cruel, wicked, unforgivable thing seemed to him not that the guards continued to beat him, but that he could not force himself into losing consciousness. Ooh, that one's deep. There were times when his nerve so forsook him that he began shouting for mercy even before the beating began, when the mere sight of a fist drawn back for a blow was enough to make him pour forth a confession of real and imaginary crimes. There were other times when he started out with the resolve of confessing nothing, when every word had to be forced out of him between gasps of pain. And there were times when he feebly tried to compromise, when he said to himself, I will confess, but not yet. I must hold out till the pain becomes unbearable. 3 more kicks, 2 more kicks, and then I'll tell them what they want. And sometimes he was beaten till he could hardly stand, then flung like a sack of potatoes to the stone floor of the cell, left to recuperate for a few hours, and then taken out and beaten again. There was also longer periods of recovery. He remembered them dimly, because they were spent chiefly in sleep or stupor. He remembered a cell with a plank bed, a sort of shelf sticking out from the wall, and a tin wash basin, and meals of hot soup and bread, and sometimes coffee. Yes. Yes, Mr. Pirate. Yes. Arr! He remembered a surly barber arriving to scrape his chin and crop his hair, and businesslike, unsympathetic men in white coats feeling his pulse, tapping his reflexes, turning up his eyelids, running harsh fingers over him in search for broken bones, and shooting needles into his arm to make him sleep. We live in 1984 now. Well, I have a bunch of other videos I've done over the past 2 or 3 days, maybe 4, reading this book. Everything is scarily accurate. But yeah, you're right. Cobson got the Jemmy though. Jemmy? Jemmy. I don't know what that is. What's a Jemmy? Sorry. Don't know what a Jemmy is. The beatings grew less frequent and became mainly a threat, a horror to which he could be sent back to at any moment when his answers were unsatisfactory. His questioners now were not ruffians in black uniforms, but party intellectuals, little rotund men with quick movements and flashing spectacles, who worked on him in relays over periods which lasted, he thought, he could not be sure, 10 or 12 hours at a stretch. These other questioners saw to it that he was in constant slight pain, but it was not chiefly pain in that they relied on. They slapped his face and wrung his ears, pulled his hair, made him stand on one leg, refused him to leave to urinate, shone glaring lights in his face until his eyes ran with water. But the aim of this was simply to humiliate him and destroy his power of arguing and reasoning. The real weapon was merciless questioning that went on and on, hour after hour, tripping him up, laying traps for him, twisting everything that he said. I've got a different vision in my mind, leave me alone. Convicting him at every step of lies and self-contradiction until he began weeping as much from shame as from nervous fatigue. Huh. How about that? Oh, hot chocolate's going warm now. It's a warm chocolate. They did a good job that when you get a hot chocolate, it don't get thicker as it gets colder. Can you imagine how hard it'd be to drink a hot chocolate? Like a proper chocolate bar. That'd be mad. Sometimes he would weep half a dozen times in a single session. Most of the time, they screamed abuse at him and threatened at every hesitation to deliver him over to the guards again. But sometimes they would suddenly change their tune. Call him comrade. Appeal to him in the name of Ingsoc and Big Brother, and ask him sorrowfully whether even now he had not enough loyalty to the party left to make him wish to undo the evil he had done. When his nerves were in rags after hours of questioning, even this appeal could reduce him to snivelling tears. In the end, the nagging voices broke him down more completely than the boots and fists of the guards. He became simply a mouth that uttered, a hand that signed whatever was demanded of him. His sole concern was to find out what they wanted him to confess, and then confess it quickly, before the bullying started anew. He confessed to the assassination of eminent party members, the distribution of seditious pamphlets, embezzlement of public funds, sale of military secrets, sabotage of every kind. He confessed that he had been a spy in the pay of the East Asian government as far back as 1968. He confessed that he was a religious believer and admirer of capitalism and a sexual pervert. He confessed that he had murdered his wife, although he knew, and his questioners must have known, that his wife was still alive. He confessed that for years he had been in personal touch with Goldstein and had been a member of an underground organisation, which included almost every human being he had ever known. It was easier to confess everything and implicate everybody. Besides, in a sense, it was all true. It was true that he had been the enemy of the party, and in the eyes of the party, there was no distinction between thought and the deed. There was also memories of another kind. They stood out in his mind, disconnectedly, like pictures with blackness all around him. He was in a cell which might have been either dark or light, because he could see nothing except a pair of eyes. Near at hand, some kind of instrument was ticking slowly and regularly. The eyes grew larger and more luminous. Suddenly, he floated out of his seat, dived into the eyes, and was swallowed up. He was strapped into a chair surrounded by dials, under dazzling lights. A man in a white coat was reading the dials. There was a tramp of heavy boots outside. The door clanged open. The wax-faced officer marched in, followed by two guards. "Room 101, said the officer. The man in the white coat did not turn around. He did not look at Winston either. He was looking only at the dials. He was rolling down a mighty corridor, a kilometre wide, full of glorious golden light, roaring with laughter and shouting out confessions at the top of his voice. He was confessing everything, even the things he had succeeded in holding back under the torture. He was relating the entire history of his life to an audience who knew it already. With him were the guards, the other questioners, the men in white coats, O'Brien, Julia, Mr. Charrington, all rolling down the corridor together and shouting with laughter. Some dreadful thing which had lain embedded in the future had somehow been skipped over and had not happened. Everything was all right. There was no more pain. The last detail of his life was laid bare. Understood. Forgiven. He was starting up from the plank bed in the half-certainty that he had heard O'Brien's voice. All through his interrogation, although he had never seen him, he had had the feeling that O'Brien was at his elbow, just out of sight. It was O'Brien who was directing everything. It was he who set the guards onto Winston and who prevented them from killing him. It was he who should have a respite when he should be fed, when he should sleep, when the drug should be pumped into his arm. It was he who asked the questions and suggested the answers. He was the tormentor. He was the protector. He was the inquisitor. He was the friend. And once, Winston could not remember whether it was in drugged-up sleep or in normal sleep, or even in a moment of wakefulness, a voice murmured in his ear, "Don't worry, Winston. You are in my keeping. For 7 years I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." He was not sure whether it was O'Brien's voice, but it was the same voice that had said to him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." In that other dream, 7 years ago, he did not remember any ending to his interrogation. There was a period of blackness and then the cell, or room, in which he now was Commas, please. Just to put a comma at the end of was. That's very useful. There was a period of blackness, and then the cell or room in which he now was had gradually materialized around him. He was almost flat on his back and unable to move. His body was held down at every essential point. Even the back of his head was gripped in some manner. O'Brien was looking down at him gravely and rather sadly. His face, seen from elbow... Sorry, I said elbow before as well. Seen from below, looked coarse and worn, with pouches under the eyes and tired lines from nose to chin. He was older than Winston had thought him. He was perhaps 48 or 50. Under his hand there was a dial with a lever on top and figures running around the face. I told you, said O'Brien, that if we meet again, it would be here. Yes, said Winston. Without warning, except a slight movement of O'Brien's hand, a wave of pain flooded his body. It was a frightening pain, because he could not see what was happening, and he had the feeling that some mortal injury was being done to him. He did not know whether the thing was really happening or whether the effect was electrically produced, but his body was being wrenched out of shape. The joints were being slowly torn apart. Although the pain had brought the sweat out of his forehead, the worst of all was the fear that his backbone was about to snap. He set his teeth and breathed hard through his nose, trying to keep silent as long as possible. "You're afraid," said O'Brien, watching his face, "that in another moment something is going to break. Your special fear is that it will be your backbone. You have a vivid mental picture of the vertebrae snapping apart and the spinal fluid dripping out. This is what you're thinking, is it not, Winston?" Winston did not answer. O'Brien drew back the lever on the dial. The wave of pain receded almost as quickly as it had come. "That was 40, said O'Brien. "You can see that the numbers on this dial run up to 100. Will you please remember throughout our conversation that I have it in my power to inflict pain upon you at any moment and to whatever degree I choose. If you tell me lies or attempt to prevaricate in any way, I will, or even fall below your usual level of intelligence, you will cry out with pain instantly. Do you understand that?" "Yes," said Winston. O'Brien's manner became less severe. He resettled his spectacles thoughtfully and took a pace or two up and down, and when he spoke his voice was gentle and patient. He had the air of a doctor, a teacher, even a priest, anxious to explain and persuade rather than to punish. "I am taking trouble with you, Winston," he said, "because you are worth trouble. You know perfectly well what is the matter with you. You have known it for years, though you have fought against the knowledge. You're mentally deranged. You suffer from defective memory. You're unable to remember real events, and you persuade yourself that you remember other events which never happened. The guy works in falsification, yeah. He looks at the things that he's got to lie about, and these things come through multiple times. He's not exactly convincing himself. It's his job to know that he's doing it. You know what I mean? Whatever. Fortunately, it is curable. You have never cured yourself of it because you did not choose to. There was a small effort of the will that you were not ready to make. Even now, I am well aware that you're clinging to your disease under the impression that it is a virtue. Now we will take an example. At this moment, which power is Oceania at war with?" "When I was arrested, Oceania was at war with East Asia." "With East Asia? Good, and Oceania's always been at war with East Asia. Has it not?" Winston drew his breath. He opened his mouth to speak and then did not speak. He could not take his eyes away from the dial. "The truth, please, Winston. Your truth. Tell me what you think you remember." "I remember that until a week before I was arrested, we were not at war with East Asia at all. We were in alliance with them. The war was against Eurasia. That had lasted for 4 years before that." O'Brien stopped him with a movement of the hand. "Another example," he said. "Some years ago you had a very serious delusion indeed. You believed that 3 men, 3 one-time party members, named Jones, Aronson and Rutherford, Men who were executed for treachery and sabotage, after making the fullest possible confession, were not guilty of the crimes they were charged with. You believed that you had seen unmistakable documentary evidence proving that their confession was false. There was a certain photograph about which you had the hallucination. You believed that you had actually held it in your hands. It was a photograph, something like this. An oblong slip of newspaper had appeared between O'Brien's fingers. For perhaps 5 seconds, it was in the angle of Winston's vision. It was a photograph, and there was no question of its identity. It was the very same photograph. It was another copy of the photograph of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. I believe that's a full stop there. Again? Damn. This is getting a bit tense, isn't it? At the party function in New York. There we go. So it is the very same picture. Remember what I said about the warm chocolate? Give me a break. Which he had chanced upon 11 years ago and promptly destroyed. For only an instant it was before his eyes, then it was out of sight again. But he had seen it, unquestionably. He had seen it. He made a desperate, agonizing effort to wrench the top half of his body free. It was impossible to move so much as a centimetre in any direction. For the moment, he had even forgotten the dial. All he wanted was to hold the photograph in his fingers again, or at least to see it. It exists! He cried. No, said O'Brien. He stepped across the room. There was a memory hole in the opposite wall. O'Brien lifted the grating. Unseen, the frail slip of paper was whirling away. In the current of warm air, it was vanishing in a flash of flame. O'Brien turned away from the wall. Ashes, he said. Not even identifiable ashes. Dust. It does not exist. It's never existed. But it did exist. It does exist. It exists in memory. I remember it and you remember it. I don't remember it, said O'Brien. Winston's heart sank. That was doublethink. He had a feeling of deadly helplessness. Ooh. Ooh. I had 3 viewers at one point. They've all gone. Oh well. I was trying to read that with some gusto too. He had a feeling of deadly hopelessness. It was as if he could have been certain that O'Brien was all lying, it would not have seemed to matter. But it was perfectly possible that O'Brien had really forgotten the photograph. And if so, then already he would have forgotten his denial of remembering it, and forgotten the act of forgetting. How could one be sure that it was simple trickery? Perhaps the lunatic dislocation in the man could... Oh, that's the bottom of the page. That was a bit quicker than I expected. Really happened. It was the thought that defeated him. O'Brien was looking down at him speculatively. More than ever, he had the air of a teacher taking pains with a wayward but promising child. Now, you see, it really is funnier in a French accent. And I like to read this for a while, if you haven't noticed, before I do put in the offer into my chat here. There is a party slogan dealing with the control of the past, he said. Repeat it, if you please. Would you kindly? Oh, by the way, turns out that Keir Starmer's giving away our last strategic spot of land of the British Empire. He's giving it away. So that's wonderful. Thank you very much, mate. You know the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire? It's because we had pretty much the whole world. And we still have it. At least for a few weeks, I think, maybe. For the unforeseeable future, we have it. But not for long. So wherever the sun is, there's always something British with the sun on it. Always. As soon as this is gone, we've lost. The British Empire will be no more. Oh well. The world can thank us later on in the future, but still, oh well. And Keir Starmer's a Zionist, apparently. In the middle of fucking England, he's a Zionist and he's using the British people for his own fucking ideals. It's ridiculous. Who controls the past? Who controls the future? Who controls the present controls the past, repeated Winston obediently. Who controls the present? Who controls the present controls the past, said O'Brien. I'm over here again, aren't I? Nodding his head with slow approval. Is it your opinion, Winston, that the past has a real existence? Again, the feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. His eyes flitted toward the dial. He not only did not know whether yes or no was the answer that would save him from pain, he did not even know which answer he believed to be true, to be the true one. Ooh, that's actually a conundrum, that one. O'Brien smiled faintly. You are no better physician, Winston, he said. Until this moment, you had never considered what it meant by existence. I will put it more precisely. Does the past exist concretely in space? Is there somewhere or other a place, a world of solid objects where the past is still happening? No. Of course the past isn't happening. That's why it's the past. The things I've read in this book up until this very second, they've gone. It's in the past. Time has snatched it away. It is never to return. Time has stolen that. Whether it goes into a black hole or into anything else, whether it evaporates into nothingness, it doesn't matter. All of it has gone. Each time I take a drag, each time I blow out, each time I read, talk to the camera, consider what's been written in chat, anything, all of that, bang, in the past, the moment it's done. Cold chocolate. Gross. Then where does the past exist? Sorry. Then where does the past exist, if at all? In records, it is written down. In records and in the mind of human memories. In memory? Well then. We, the party, control all records and we control all memories. Then we control the past, do we not? But how can you stop people remembering things? Cried Winston, again momentarily forgetting the dial. It is involuntarily. It is outside oneself. How can you control your memory? You have not controlled... How can you control memory? You've not controlled man. O'Brien's manner grew stern again. He laid his hand on the dial. On the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. That is what has brought you here. You are here because you have failed in humility, in self-discipline. Jemmy book. I think you've said that. No, someone else said Jemmy earlier. Can you watch Jemmy? Is that just like a longer word of a gem of a book? Is that what you're saying? That's blowing my mind, that one. But yeah, it's truly incredible. It's the torture scene at the moment. It's chapter 5 that catches my attention. I read that by accident, or not by accident, on purpose, and it just gripped me. I was like, read the book from the beginning. And as I'm reading the book from the beginning, inside this book, Winston gets another book, and he has the same affliction that I did, where you just skip a few chapters and then you go back to the beginning because it's kind of interesting. And I'm like, fuck you for getting in my head like that, you damn thing. And it was written in 49. Or at least published, anyway. I've been talking a lot about this. How are you doing, Commissar? You would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You prefer to be a lunatic, a minority of one. Only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. You believe that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. You also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone else sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, that the reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind, nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case, soon perishes. Only in the mind of the party, which is a collective and immortal. Whether the party holds to be the truth, it is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. That is the fact that you have got to relearn, Winston. It needs an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. You must humble yourself before you can become sane. He paused for a few moments, as though to allow what he had been saying to sink in. Do you remember, he went on, writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4? Yes, said Winston. O'Brien held up his left hand. It's backwards to Winston, with the thumb hidden and the 4 fingers extended. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? And if the party says that it is not 4 but 5, and if the party says it's not 4 but 5, how many? 4. The word ended in a gasp of pain. The needle of the dial had shot up to 55. The sweat had sprung out all over Winston's body. The air tore into his lungs and issued again in deep groans, which even by clenching his teeth could not stop. O'Brien watched him, the 4 fingers still extended. He drew back the lever. This time the pain was only slightly eased. How many fingers, Winston? 4. The needle went up to 60. How many fingers, Winston? 4. What else can I say? It's 4. The needle must have risen again, but he did not look at it. The heavy, stern face and the 4 fingers filled his vision. The fingers stood up before his eyes like pillars, enormous, blurry, and seeming to vibrate, but unmistakably 4. How many fingers, Winston? 4. Stop it. How can you go on? 4. 4. How many fingers, Winston? 5. 5. 5. No, Winston, that is no use. You're lying. You still think there are 4. How many fingers, please? 4, 5, 4. Anything you like. Only stop it. Stop the pain. Abruptly, he was sitting up with O'Brien's arm around his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that had held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering. The tears were rolling down his cheeks. For a moment he clung to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavy arm around his shoulders. He had a feeling that O'Brien was his protector, that the pain was something that came from outside, from some other source, and that it was O'Brien who would save him from it. You are a slow learner, Winston, said O'Brien gently. How can I help it? He blubbered. How can I help seeing what is in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston. Sometimes they are 5. Sometimes they are 3. Sometimes they are all of them at once. You must try harder. It is not easy to become sane. He laid Winston down on the bed. The grip of his limbs tightened again, but the pain had ebbed away and the trembling had stopped, leaving him merely weak and cold. O'Brien motioned with his head to the man in the white coat, who had stood immobile throughout the proceedings. The man in the white coat bent down and looked closely into Winston's eyes, felt his pulse, laid an ear against his chest, tapped here and there, then he nodded to O'Brien. "Again," said O'Brien. The pain flowed into Winston's body. The needle must be at 70, 75. He had shut his eyes this time. He knew that the fingers were still there, and still for, and all that mattered was somehow to stay alive until the spasm was over. He had ceased to notice whether he was crying or not. The pain lessened again. He opened his eyes. O'Brien had drawn back the lever. "How many fingers, Winston?" "4. I suppose there are 4. I would see 5 if I could. I'm trying to see 5. "Which do you wish to persuade me that you see 5, or you really... or... Which do you wish? To persuade me that you see 5, or to really see them?" To really see them? "Again," said O'Brien. Perhaps the needle was 89, 80, 90. Winston could not intermittently remember why the pain was happening behind the screwed up eyelids of forest of fingers to be moving in a sort of dance, weaving in and out, disappearing behind one another and reappearing again. Sorry, I just I think the story's getting to me. He was trying to count them. He could not remember why. He knew only that it was impossible to count them, and that he was somehow due to the mysterious identity between 5 and 4. The pain died down again. Oh, did I just skip a line? Sorry. When he opened his eyes, it was to find that he was still seeing the same thing. Innumerable fingers, like moving trees, were still streaming past in either direction, crossing and recrossing. He shut his eyes again. "How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?" I don't know. You'll kill me if you do that again. 4, 5, 6. In all honesty, I don't know." "Better," said O'Brien. A needle slid into Winston's arm. Almost in the same instant, a blissful healing warmth spread through his body. The pain was already half forgotten. He opened his eyes and looked up gratefully at O'Brien, at the sight of the heavy, land face, so ugly and so intelligent. His heart seemed to turn over. If he could have moved, he would have stretched out a hand and laid it on O'Brien's arm. He had never loved him so deeply at this moment, and not merely because he had stopped the pain. The old feeling, that at the bottom it did not matter whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy, had come back. O'Brien was a person who could be talked to. Perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as to be understood. What? Is that my fault? Nah, I'm doing fine. Interesting. O'Brien had tortured him to the edge of lunacy, and in a little while it was certain that he would send him to his death. It made no difference. In some sense that went deeper than friendship. They were intimates, somewhere or other. Although the actual words might never be spoken, there was a place where they could meet and talk. O'Brien was looking down at him with an expression which suggested that the same thought might be in his own mind. When he spoke, it was in an easy conversational tone. "Do you know where you are?" said Winston. "Do you know where you are, Winston?" he said. "I don't know. I can guess. I'm in the Ministry of Love." "Sorry." "Do you know how long you've been here?" "I don't know. Days, weeks, months. I think it's months." "And why do you imagine that we bring people to this place?" "To make them confess." "No, it's not the reason." "Try again." "To punish them." "No!" exclaimed O'Brien. His voice had changed extraordinarily. His face had suddenly become both stern and animated. "No! Not merely to extract your confession, not to punish you. Shall I tell you why we've brought you here? To cure you, to make you sane. Will you understand, Winston, that no one whom we bring to this place ever leaves our hands uncured? We are not interested in those stupid crimes you've committed. The party isn't interested in the overt act. The thought is all we care about. We do not merely destroy our enemies, we change them. Do you understand what I mean by that?" In his bending over by Winston, his face looked enormous because of its nearness. and hideously ugly because it was seen from below. Moreover, it was filled with a sort of exaltation, a lunatic intensity. Again, Winston's heart shrank. If it had been possible, he would have cowered deeper into the bed. He felt certain that O'Brien was about to twist the dial out of sheer wantonness. At this moment, however, O'Brien turned away. He took a pace or two up and down. Then he continued less vehemently. The first thing for you to understand is that in this place there are no martyrdoms. You have read of the religious persecutions of the past. In the Middle Ages there was the Inquisition. It was a failure. It set out to eradicate heresy and ended up perpetuating it. For every heretic it burned at the stake, thousands of others rose up. Why was that? Because the Inquisition killed its enemies in the open, and killed them while they were still unrepentant. In fact, it killed them because they was unrepentant. Men were dying because they would not abandon their true beliefs. Naturally, all the glory belonged to the victim, and all the shame to the inquisitor who burned him. Later, in the 20th century, there were the totalitarians, as they were called. There were the German Nazis and Russian communists. The Russians persecuted heresy more cruelly than the Inquisition had done, and they imagined that they had learned from the mistakes of the past. They knew, at any rate, that one must not make martyrs. Before they exposed their victims to public trial, they deliberately set themselves to destroy their dignity. They wore them down by torture and solitude until they were despicable, cringing wretches, confessing whatever was put into their mouths, covering themselves with abuse. Accusing and sheltering behind one another, whimpering for mercy. And yet only after a few years the same thing had happened over again. The dead men had become martyrs, and their degradation was forgotten. Once again, why was it? In the first place, because it was the confessions that they had made were obviously extorted and untrue. We do not make mistakes of that kind. All the confessions that are uttered here are true. We make them true. And above all, we do not allow the dead to rise up against us. You must stop imagining that posterity will vindicate you, Winston. Posterity will never hear of you. You will be lifted clean from the stream of history. You shall return into gas and pour you into the We shall turn you into gas and pour you into the stratosphere. Nothing will remain of you. Not a name in register, not a memory in a living brain. You will be annihilated in the past as well as in the future. You will never have existed. Then why bother to torture me? Thought Winston. With a momentary bitterness, O'Brien checked his with a moment of bitterness. O'Brien checked his step as though Winston had uttered the thought aloud. His large, ugly face came nearer, and the eyes a little narrowed. You are thinking, he said, that since we intend to destroy you utterly, so that nothing you say or do can make the smallest difference. In that case, why do we go to the trouble of interrogating you first? That is what you were thinking, was it not? Yes, said Winston. O'Brien smiled lightly. You are a flaw in the pattern, Winston. You are a stain that must be wiped out. Did I not tell you just now that we are different from the persecutors of the past? We are not content with negative obedience, nor even with the most abject submission. When finally you surrender to us, it must be of your own free will. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. We convert him. We capture his inner man. We reshape him. We burn all evil and all illusion out of him. We bring him over to our side, not in appearance, but genuinely, heart and soul. We make him one of ourselves before we kill him. It is intolerable to us that an erroneous thought should exist anywhere in the world, however secret and powerless it may be. Even in the instant of death, we cannot permit any deviation. In the old days, the heretic walked to the stake, still a heretic, proclaiming his heresy, exulting in it. Even the victim of the Russian pages could carry rebellion locked up in his skull as he walked down the passage waiting for a bullet. But we make him perfect. Sorry, but we make the brain perfect before we blow it out. The command of the old despotisms was "thou shalt not." The command of the totalitarians was "thou shalt." Our command is "thou art." No one whom we bring into this place ever stands out against us. Everyone is washed clean, even those three miserable traitors in whose innocence you once believed, Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. In the end, we broke them down, and I took part in their interrogation myself. I saw them gradually worn down, whimpering, grovelling, weeping, and in the end, it was not with pain or fear, only with penitence. By the time we had finished with them, they were only the shells of men. There was nothing left of them, except sorrow for what they had done, and love for Big Brother. It was touching to see how they loved him. They begged to be shot quickly, so that they could die with their while their minds were still clean. His voice had grown almost dreamy. The exaltation, the lunatic enthusiasm, was still in his face. He did not pretend. He is not pretending, though, Winston. He is not pretending, thought Winston. He is not a hypocrite. He believes every word he says. What most oppressed him was the consciousness of his own intellectual inferiority. He watched the heavy yet graceful form strolling to and fro, in and out of the range of his vision. O'Brien was a being in all ways larger than himself. There was no idea that he had ever had, or could have, that O'Brien had not long ago known, examined, and rejected. His mind contained Winston's mind. But in that case, how could it be true that O'Brien was mad? It must be he, Winston, who was mad. O'Brien halted and looked down at him. His voice had grown stern again. Do not imagine that you will save yourself, Winston. However completely you surrender to us, no one who has once gone astray is ever spared. And even if we choose to let you live out the natural term of your life, still you would never escape from us. What happens to you here is forever. Understand that in advance. We shall crush you down to the point from which there is no coming back. Things will happen to you from which you could not recover. If you lived 1,000 years, never again will you be capable of ordinary human feeling. Everything will be dead inside you. Never again will you be capable of love or friendship, or joy of living, or laughter, or curiosity, or courage, or integrity. You will be hollow. We shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves. It's one of those parties. All right. He paused and signed to the man in the white coat. Winston was aware of some heavy piece of apparatus being pushed into the place behind his head. O'Brien had sat down beside the bed, so that his face was almost on a level with Winston's. 3,000, he said, speaking over Winston's head to the man in the white coat. Two soft pads which felt slightly moist clamped themselves against Winston's temples. He quailed. There was a pain coming, a new kind of pain. O'Brien laid his hands reassuringly, almost kindly, on his. This time, it will not hurt, he said. Keep your eyes fixed on mine. You're going to stare at him while you're doing this. You are mad. You are mad. You're sick. You're sick. You're going to stare at him while no. At this moment there was a devastating explosion, or what seemed like an explosion, though it was not certain whether there was any noise. There was undoubtedly a blinding flash of light. Winston was not hurt, only prostrated. Although he had already been laying on his back when the thing happened, he had a curious feeling that he had been knocked into that position. A terrific painless blow had flattened him out. Although something had happened inside his head, as his eyes regained their focus, he remembered who he was and where he was, and recognized the face that was gazing into his own. But somewhere or other there was a large patch of emptiness, as though a piece had been taken out of his brain. It will not last, said O'Brien. Look me in the eyes. What country is Oceania at war with? Winston thought. He knew what was meant by Oceania and that he himself was a citizen of Oceania. He also remembered that Eurasia and East Asia, but who was at war with whom he did not know. In fact, he had not been aware that there was any war. I don't remember. Oceania's at war with East Asia. Do you remember that now? Yeah, I do. Yeah. Oceania's always been at war with East Asia. Since the beginning of your life, since the beginning of the party, since the beginning of history, the war has continued without a break. Always the same war. Do you remember that? Yeah. 11 years ago, you created a legend about 3 men who had been condemned to death for treachery. You pretended that you had seen a piece of paper which proved them innocent. No such piece of paper ever existed. You invented it, and later you grew to believe in it. You remember now the very moment at which you first invented it. Do you remember that? Yes. Just now I held up the fingers of my hand to you. You saw 5 fingers. Do you remember that? Yeah. O'Brien held up the fingers of his left hand, with the thumb concealed. There are 5 fingers here. Do you see 5 fingers? Yes. And he did see them. For a fleeting instant, before the scenery of his mind changed, he saw 5 fingers, and there was no deformity, and then everything was normal again. And the old fear, the hatred, the bewilderment came crowding back again. But there had been a moment, he did not know how long, 30 seconds perhaps, of luminous certainty, when each new suggestion of O'Brien's had filled up a patch of emptiness and become absolute truth, and when 2 and 2 could have been 3 as easily as 5. If that were what was needed, it had faded, but before O'Brien had dropped his hand, but though he could not recapture it, he could remember it as one remembers a vivid experience at some period of one's life, when one was in effect a different person. You see now, said O'Brien, that it is at any rate possible. Yes, said Winston. O'Brien stood up with a satisfied air. Over to his left, Winston saw the man with a white coat break an ampule and drew back the plunger of a syringe. O'Brien turned up to Winston with a smile. In almost old manner, he resettled his spectacles on his nose. Do you remember writing in your diary, he said, that it did not matter whether I was a friend or an enemy, since I was at least a person who understood you, and you could be talked to. You were right. I enjoy talking to you. Your mind appeals to me. It resembles my own mind, except that you happen to be insane. Before we bring the session to an end, you can ask me a few questions, if you choose. Any question I like? Anything. He saw that Winston's eyes were upon the dial. It is switched off. What is your first question? What have you done with Julia? Said Winston. O'Brien smiled again. She betrayed you, Winston, immediately, unreservedly. I have seldom seen anyone come over to us so promptly. You would hardly recognize her if you saw her. All her rebelliousness, her deceit, her folly, her dirty-mindedness, everything has been burned out of her. It was a perfect conversion, a textbook case. You tortured her. O'Brien left this unanswered. Next question, he said. Does Big Brother exist? Of course he exists. The party exists. Big Brother is the embodiment of the party. Does he exist in the same way I exist? You do not exist, said O'Brien. Once again the sense of helplessness assailed him. He knew, or he could imagine, the arguments which proved his own non-existence, but they were nonsense. They were only a play on words. Did not the statement, "You do not exist," contain a logical absurdity? But what use was it to say so? His mind shriveled as he thought of the unanswerable, mad arguments which O'Brien would demolish him. I think I exist, he said wearily. I'm conscious of my own identity. I was born, and I shall die. I have arms and legs. I occupy a particular point in space. No other solid object can occupy the same point simultaneously. In that sense, Does Big Brother exist? It is of no importance. He exists. Will Big Brother ever die? Of course not. How could he die? Next question. Does the Brotherhood exist? That, Winston, you will never know. If we choose to set you free, when we have finished with you, and if you live to be 90 years old, still you will never learn whether the answer to that question is yes or no. As long as you live, it will be an unsolved riddle in your mind. Winston lay silent. His breast rose and fell a little faster. He still had not asked the question that had come into his mind first. He had got to ask it, and yet it was as though his tongue would not utter it. There was a trace of amusement in O'Brien's face. Even his spectacles seemed to wear an ironical gleam. He knows, thought Winston suddenly. He knows what I'm going to ask. At the thought of the words burst out of him. What's in room 101? The expression on O'Brien's face did not change, and he answered dryly. You know what's in room 101, Winston. Everyone knows what's in room 101. He raised a finger to the man in the white coat. Evidently, the session was at an end. A needle jerked into Winston's arm. He sank almost instantly into deep sleep. Ooh. What is that, an hour? I feel like that's an hour. That's an hour. Right on. So we're on chapter 3. What page is this? 328. Right on. What is that? 65 pages left. Ish. Oh, doing well. Oh. In view. There we go. At least we know where we are. This whole torture thing is fucking mad. It's kind of cruel. Cobson got the Gemmy though. I don't know what a Gemmy is. I'm gonna take a moment to stop reading. I want to find out what a Gemmy is. Ironically, by reading. Go away. You can go away too. That's what I thought. Now who the fuck is Cobson? That's a question. Let's put that back. Let's put that back. There's no reference. I want to know what people are talking about. That's bugging me just a little bit. Huh. I have no alcohol. Oh well. Let's get reading through chapter 3 then, when I'm in the right place. There are 3 stages in your reintegration, said O'Brien. There is learning, there's understanding, and there is acceptance. It is time for you to enter upon the 2nd stage. As always, Winston was lying flat on his back, but of late his bonds were looser. They still held him to the bed, but he could move his knees a little and could turn his head from side to side and raise his arms from the elbow. The dial also had grown to me less of a terror. He could evade its pangs if he was quick-witted enough. It was chiefly when he was showed stupidity that O'Brien pulled the lever. Sometimes they got through a whole session without the use of a dial. He could not remember how many sessions there had been. The whole process seemed to stretch out over a long, indefinite time, weeks possibly, and the intervals between the sessions might sometimes have been days, sometimes only an hour or 2. As you lie there, said O'Brien, you have often wondered. What have you even asked? you have even asked me, why the Ministry of Love should expend so much time and trouble on you. And when you were free, you were puzzled by what was essentially the same question. You could grasp the mechanics of the society you lived in, but not its underlying motives. Do you remember writing in your diary, I understand how, I do not understand why. It was when you thought about why that you doubted your own sanity. You have read the book, Goldstein's book, or parts of it at least. Did it tell you anything that you did not know already? You have read it, said Winston. I wrote it. That is to say, I collaborated in writing it. No book is produced individually, as you know. Is it true, what it says? As description, yes. The program it sets forth is nonsense. The secret accumulation of... What the fuck was that? The secret accumulation of knowledge, a gradual spread of enlightenment, ultimately a proletarian rebellion. The overthrow of the party. You foresaw yourself that was what it could say. It is all nonsense. The proletarians will never revolt, not in 1,000 years or 1,000,000. There was a stream I did where I actually read Winston reading the book, so he basically just reading a book within a book. Very Inception. I turned off the microphone. Nobody watched. So no one went, there's no sound. And I didn't know until I did another stream. And as I do, I test the microphone when it starts. That's what happened. So the book within the book, I've missed it. Like he says, it's nonsense. So if he's saying it's nonsense in the book about the book that you read earlier, when you're just trying to get through it, you don't have to hear me reading in the book within the book. I promise you didn't miss much. Not in 1,000 years or 1,000,000. They cannot. I do not have to tell you the reason. You know it already. If you have ever cherished any dreams of violent insurrection, you must abandon them. There is no way in which the party can be overthrown. The rule of the party is forever. Make that the starting point of your thoughts. He came closer to the bed. Forever, he repeated. And now let us get back to the question of how and why. You understand well enough how the party maintains itself in power. Now tell me why we cling to power. What is our motive? Why should we want power? Go on, speak, he added as Winston remained silent. Nevertheless, Winston did not speak for another moment or two. A feeling of weariness had overwhelmed him. The faint, mad gleam of enthusiasm had come back into O'Brien's face. He knew in advance what O'Brien would say, that the party did not seek power for its own ends, but for the good of the majority, that it sought power because men in the mass were frail, cowardly creatures who could not endure liberty or face the truth and must be ruled over with systematically deceived by others who were stronger than themselves, that the choice for mankind lay between freedom and happiness, and that, for the great bulk of mankind, happiness was better, that the party was the eternal guardian of the weak, a dedicated sect doing evil that good might come, sacrificing its own happiness to that of the others. The terrible thing, thought Winston, the terrible thing was that when O'Brien said this, he would believe it. You could see it in his face. O'Brien knew everything 1,000 times better than Winston knew what the world was really like. In what degradation the mass of human beings lived, and by what lies and barbarities the party kept them there. He had understood it all, weighed it all, and made no difference. All was justified by the ultimate purpose. What can you do, thought Winston, against a lunatic who is more intelligent than yourself, who gives your arguments a fair hearing, then simply persists in his lunacy? You are ruling over us for our own good, he said feebly. Through his body, O'Brien had pushed the lever of the dial up to 35. That was stupid, Winston. Stupid, he said. You should know better than to say a thing like that. He pulled the lever back and continued. Now I will tell you the answer to my question. It is this. The party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are not interested in the good of the others. We are interested solely in power, not wealth, luxury, long life, or happiness. Power. Pure power. What's power? What pure power means you will understand presently. We are different from all the oligarchies of the past, in that we know what we are doing. All the others, even those who resembled ourselves, were cowards and hypocrites. The German Nazis and the Russian communists, I don't know what's happening to the accent here, but it's happening. Deal with it. Came very close to us in their methods, but they never had the courage to recognize their own motives. They pretended, perhaps they even believed, that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and that just round the corner there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. We are not like that. We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes a revolution in order to establish a dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. Now do you begin to understand me? Winston was struck, as he had been struck before, by the tiredness of O'Brien's face. It was strong and fleshy and brutal. It was full of intelligence and a sort of controlled passion which he felt himself helpless, but it was tired. There were pouches under his eyes, the skin sagged from his cheekbones. O'Brien leaned over him, deliberately bringing the worn face nearer. I'm glad there's a full stop there. Oh, definitely 60 pages to go. You are thinking, he said, that my face is old and tired. You're thinking that I talk of power, and yet I am not even able to prevent the decay of my own body. Can you not understand, Winston, that the individual is only a cell? The weariness of the cell is the vigor of the organism. Do you not die when you can cut? Do you die when you cut your fingernails? He turned away from the bed and began strolling up and down again, one hand in his pocket. We are the priests of power, he said. God is power. But at present, power is only a word so far as you are concerned. I guess this is how he's I guess this is how this is going. This is happening. It is time for you to gather some idea of what power means. Fuck it. The first thing you must realize is that power is collective. The individual only has power insofar as he ceases to be an individual. You know the party slogan. Freedom is slavery. Hey, has it ever occurred to you that it is reversible? Slavery is freedom. Alone, free. The human being is always defeated. It must be so, because every human being is doomed to die, which is the greatest of all failures. Huh. I just need to look for something. Never mind, never mind. But if he can make a complete utter submission, he can escape from his identity. If he can merge himself in the party so that he is the party, then he is all-powerful and immortal. The second thing for you to realize is that power is power over human beings. Over the body, but above all, over the mind. Power over matter, external reality, as you would call it, is not important. Already our control over matter is absolute. He's morphing into Arnold Schwarzenegger, I do apologize. He's not talking right now, but he will be back. For a moment, Winston ignored the dial. He made a violent effort to raise himself into a sitting position, and merely succeeding in wrenching his body painfully. How can you control matter? He burst out. You don't even control the climate or the law of gravity, and there are disease, pain, and death. And O'Brien silenced him with a movement of his hand. We control matter because we control the mind. Reality is inside the skull. You will learn by degrees, Winston, there is nothing that we could not do. Invisibility, levitation, anything. I could float off this floor like a soap bubble if I wished to. I do not wish to, because the party does not wish it. You must get rid of those 19th century ideas about the laws of nature. Oh shit. We make the laws of nature. Ah, but you don't. You're not even masters of this planet. What about Eurasia and East Asia? You have not conquered them yet. Unimportant. We shall conquer them when it suits us. And if we did not, what difference would it make? We can shut them out of existence. Oceania is the world. But the world itself is only a speck of dust. A man is tiny, helpless. How long has he been in existence? For millions of years? The earth was uninhabited. Nonsense. The earth is as old as we are, no older. How could it be older? Nothing exists except through human consciousness. But the rocks are full of bones and extinct animals, mammoths, mastodons, the enormous reptiles which lived here long before man was ever heard of. Have you ever seen those bones, Winston? Of course not. 19th century biologists invented them. Before man, there was nothing. After man, if he could come to an end, there would be nothing. Outside man, there is nothing. Yo, man, it's deep. But with the whole universe like it's outside us. Look at the stars, man. Look at some of them a million light years away. They are out of our reach forever. What are the stars? Said O'Brien indifferently. They're bits of fire, man. A few kilometers away. Oh, sorry. He's speaking. They are bits of fire. Why am I doing that accent twice? What am I doing? They're bits of fire a few kilometers away. We could reach them if we wanted to. Or we could blot them out. The earth is the center of the universe. The sun and the stars go around it. Winston made another convulsive movement. This time he did not say anything. O'Brien continued as though answering a spoken objection. For certain purposes, of course. That is not true. When we navigate the ocean, or when we predict an eclipse, we often find it convenient to assume that the earth goes around the sun, and that the stars are millions upon millions of kilometers away. But what of it? Do you suppose it is beyond us to produce a dual system of astronomy? The stars can be near or distant according as we need them. Do you suppose our mathematicians are unequal to that? Have you forgotten doublethink? Winston shrank back upon the bed. Whatever he said, the swift answer crushed him like a bludgeon. And yet he knew that he was in the right. The belief that nothing exists outside your own mind, surely there must be some way of demonstrating that it was false. Had it not been exposed long ago as a fallacy, there was even a name for it which he had forgotten. A faint smile twitched the corners of O'Brien's mouth as he looked down at him. I told you, Winston, he said, that the metaphysics is not your strong point. The word you're trying to think of is solipsism. But you are mistaken. This is not solipsism. Collective solipsism, if you like. But that is a different thing. In fact, the opposite thing. All this is a digression, he added in a different tone. The real power, the power we have to fight for night and day, is not power over things, but over men. He paused for a moment, assumed again his air of schoolmaster questioning and promising pupil. How does one man assert his power over another, Winston? Winston thought. By making him suffer, he said. Exactly, by making him suffer. Obedience is not enough unless he is suffering. How can you be sure that he is obeying your will and not his own? Power is in inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. Do you begin to see, then, what kind of world we are creating? It is the exact opposite of the stupid hedonistic utopias that the old reformers imagined. A world of fear and treachery and torment, a world of trampling and being trampled upon, a world which will grow not less but more merciless as it refines itself. Progress in our world will be progress towards more pain. The old civilizations claimed that they were founded on love or justice. Ours is founded upon hatred. In our world there will be no emotions, except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. Everything else we shall destroy. Everything. Already we are breaking down the habits of thought which have survived from before the revolution. We have cut the links between child and parent, no man, and between man, and between man and woman. No one dares trust a wife, a child, or a friend, any longer. But in the future there will be no wives and no friends. Children will be taken from their mothers at birth, as one takes eggs from a hen. The sex instinct will be eradicated. Procreation will be an annual formality, like the renewal of a ration card. We shall abolish the orgasm. Our neurologists are at work upon it now. There will be no loyalty except loyalty toward the party. There will be no love except the love of Big Brother. There will be no laughter except the laugh of triumph over a defeated enemy. There will be no art, literature, science. When we are omnipotent, we shall have no more need of science. There will be no distinction between beauty and ugliness. There will be no curiosity, enjoyment of the process of life. All competing pleasures will be destroyed. But always, do not forget this, Winston. Always there will be the intoxication of power, constantly increasing and constantly growing subtler. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of a victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of a future, imagine a boot stepping on a human face forever. He paused, as though he expected Winston to speak. Winston had tried to shrink back into the surface of the bed again. He could not say anything. His heart seemed to be frozen. O'Brien went on. And remember that it is forever. The face will always be there and stamped on. The heretic, the enemy of society, will always be there, so that he can be defeated and humiliated over again. Everything that you have undergone since you have been in our hands, all that will continue and worse. The espionage, the betrayals, the arrests, the tortures, the executions, the experiences will never cease. It will be a world of terror as much as a world of triumph. The more the party is powerful, the less it will be tolerant. The weaker the opposition, the tighter the despotism. Goldstein and his heresies will live forever. Every day, at every moment, they will be defeated, discredited, ridiculed, spat upon, and yet they will always survive. This drama that I have played out with you during 7 years will be played out over and over again, generation after generation, always in subtler forms. Always we shall have the heretic here at our mercy, screaming with pain, broken up, contemptible, and in the end utterly penitent, saved from himself, crawling to our feet of his own accord. That is the world we are preparing, Winston. A world of victory after victory, triumph after triumph, an endless pressing upon the nerve of power. You are beginning, I can see, to realize that the world will be like what the world will be like. But in the end, you will do more than understand it. You will accept it, welcome it, become a part of it. Winston had recovered himself sufficiently to speak. You can't, he said. What do you mean by that remark, Winston? You could not create such a world as you have just described. It is a dream. It is impossible. Why? It's impossible to found a civilization on fear and hatred and cruelty. It would never endure. And why not? It would have no vitality. It would disintegrate. It would commit suicide. Nonsense. You're under the impression that hatred is more exhausting than love. Why should it be? And if it were, what difference would that make? Suppose that we chose to wear ourselves out faster. Suppose that we quicken the tempo of human life till men are senile at 30. What difference would it make? Can you not understand that the death of the individual is not death? The party is immortal. As usual, the voice had battered Winston into helplessness. Moreover, he was in dread that if he persisted in his disagreement, O'Brien would twist the dial again. And yet he could not keep silent. Feebly, without arguments, with nothing to support him except his inarticulate horror of what O'Brien had said, he returned to the attack. I don't know. I don't care. Somehow you'll fail. Something'll defeat you. Life will defeat you. We control life, Winston, at all its levels. You are imagining that there is something called human nature which will be outraged by what we do and will turn against us. But we create human nature. We are infinitely malleable. Or perhaps you have returned to your old idea that the proletarians or slaves will arise and overthrow us. Put it out of your mind. They are helpless. Like the animals, humanity is the party. The others are outside, irrelevant. I don't care. In the end, they will beat you. Sooner or later, they will see you for what you are, and then they will tear you to pieces. Huh. I wonder if that'll be true. Do you see any evidence that is happening? A little bit. Or any reason why it should? A little bit. No, I believe it. I know that you will fail. There is something in the universe, I don't know, some spirit, some principle that you will never overcome. Do you believe in God, Winston? No? Then what is it, this principle that will defeat us? I don't know, the spirit of man? And you consider yourself a man? Yes. And if you are a man, Winston, you are the last man. Your kind is extinct. We are the inheritors. Do you understand that you are alone? You are outside history. You are non-existent. His manner changed and he said more harshly, and you consider yourself morally superior to us, with our lies and our cruelty? Yes, I consider myself superior. O'Brien did not speak. Two other voices were speaking. After a moment, Winston recognized one of them as his own. It was a soundtrack of the conversation he had had with O'Brien, and the night he had enrolled himself in the Brotherhood. He heard himself promising to lie, to steal, to forge, to murder, encourage drug-taking, prostitution, decimate venereal disease, and throw vitriol in a child's face. O'Brien made a small, impatient gesture, as though to say the demonstration was hardly worth making. Then he turned a switch, and the voices stopped. "Get up from that bed," he said. The bonds had loosened themselves. Winston lowered himself to the floor and stood up unsteadily. "You're the last man," said O'Brien. "You are the guardian of the human spirit. You shall see yourself as you are. Take off your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle." I don't know. Winston undid the bit of string that held his overalls together. The zip fastener had long since been wrenched out of them. He could not remember whether at any time since his arrest had taken off all of his clothes at one time. Beneath the overalls his body was looped with filthy yellowish rags, just recognizable as the remnants of underclothes. As he slid them to the ground he saw that there was a three-sided mirror at the far end of the room. He approached it and stopped short. An involuntary cry had broken out of him. "Go on," said O'Brien. "Stand between the wings at the mirror. You shall see the side view as well." He had stopped because he was frightened. A bowed, grey-coloured, skeleton-like thing was coming towards him. Its actual appearance was frightening, and not merely the fact that he knew it to be himself. He moved closer to the glass. The creature's face seemed to be protruded because of its bent carriage, a forlorn jailbird's face with a knobby forehead running back into a bald scalp, a crooked nose, bad-looking cheekbones, above which his eyes were fierce and watchful. The cheeks were seamed, the mouth had a drawn-in look. Certainly it was his own face, but it seemed to him that he had changed more than he had changed inside. The emotions it registered would be different from the ones he felt. He had gone partially bald. For the first moment he had thought he had gone grey as well, but it was only the scalp that was grey, except for his hands and a circle of his face. His body was grey all over, with with ancient ingrained dirt, here and there, under there, everywhere. Here and there under the dirt, there were the red scars of wounds, and near the ankle of varicose also was an inflamed mass with flakes of skin peeling off of it. But the truly frightening thing was the emaciation of his body. The barrel of ribs was as narrow as that of a skeleton. The legs had shrunk so that the knees were thicker than the thighs. He saw now that O'Brien had meant about his side view. The curvature of his spine was astonishing. The thin shoulders had hunched forward so that to make a cavity of his chest. The scraggy neck had to be bending double under the weight of the skull. I guess he would have said that it was the body of a man of 60, suffering from some malignant disease. You have thought, sometimes, said O'Brien, that my face, the face of a member in a party, looks old and worn. What do you think of your face? He seized Winston's shoulder and spun him round so that he was facing him. He seized Winston's shoulder. Look at the condition you're in, he said. Look at this filthy grime all over your body. Look at the dirt between your toes. Look at that disgusting running sore on your leg. Do you know that you stink like a goat? Probably you have ceased to notice it. Look at your emaciation. Do you see? I can make my thumb and forefinger meet around your bicep. I could snap your neck like a carrot. Do you know that you have lost 25 kilograms since you've been in our cans? Even your hair is coming out in handfuls. Look! He plucked out Winston's head and brought away a tuft of hair. Open your mouth. 9, 10, 11 teeth left. How many had you when you came to us? And the few you had left are dropping out of your head. Look here. He seized one of Winston's remaining front teeth between his powerful thumb and forefinger. A twinge of pain shot through Winston's jaw. O'Brien wrenched the loose tooth out by the roots. He tossed it across the cell. You're rotting away, he said. You're falling to pieces. And what are you? A bag of filth. Now turn around and look in that mirror again. Do you see that thing facing you? That is the last man. If you're human, that's humanity. Now put your clothes on again. Winston began to dress himself with slow, stiff movements. Until now, he had not seemed to notice how thin and weak he was. Only one thought stirred in his mind, that he must have been in this place longer than he had imagined. Then suddenly, as he fixed the miserable rags around himself, a feeling of pity for his ruined body overcame him. Before he knew what he was doing, he had burst into tears. He was aware of his ugliness, his gracelessness, the bundle of bones in filthy clothes sitting weeping in harsh white light, but he could not stop himself. O'Brien laid a hand on his shoulder, almost kindly. It will not last forever, he said. You can escape from it whenever you choose. Everything depends on yourself. You did it, sobbed Winston. You reduced me to this state. No, Winston. You reduced yourself to it. This is what you accepted when you set yourself up against the party. It was all contained in that first act. Nothing has happened that you did not foresee. He paused and then went on. We've beaten you, Winston. We've broken you up. You have seen what your body's like. Your mind is in the same state. I do not think there can be much pride left in you. You have been kicked and flogged and insulted. You have screamed with pain. You have rolled on the floor in your own blood and vomit. You've whimpered for mercy. You've betrayed everybody and everything. Can you think of a single degradation that has not happened to you? Winston had stopped. Weeping through the tears was still oozing out of his eyes. He looked up at O'Brien. I have not betrayed Julia, he said. O'Brien looked down at him thoughtfully. No, he said. No, that's perfectly true. You have not betrayed Julia. The peculiar reverence of O'Brien, which nothing seemed able to destroy, flooded Winston's heart again. How intelligent, he thought. How intelligent! Never did O'Brien fail to understand what was said to him. Anyone else on earth would have answered promptly that he had betrayed Julia. For what was there that they had not screwed out of him under the torture? He had told them everything he knew about her habits, character, past life. He'd confessed in the most trivial detail everything that had happened at their meetings. all that he had said to her, and she to him. Their black market meals, adulteries, their vague plottings against the party, everything. And yet, in a sense in which he intended the word, he had not betrayed her. He had not stopped loving her. His feelings towards her had remained the same. O'Brien had seen what he meant without the need for explanation. Tell me, he said, how soon will they shoot? Tell me, he said, how long will they shoot? How soon will they shoot me? Might be a long time, said O'Brien. You're a difficult case. But don't give up hope. Everyone is cured sooner or later. In the end, we shall shoot you. Fucking hell. You're a dick, O'Brien. You're a bloody dick. Chill out, dude. Wow, my back hurts. Chapter 4, I believe. What is it, an hour and a half? An hour and a half. Chapter 4. Here we go. What page are we on? Can I see it? 345. Oh. Oh. 50 pages to go. Chapter 4. He was much better. He was growing fatter and stronger every day. If it was proper to speak of days. The white light and the humming sound were the same as ever, but the cell was a little more comfortable than the others he had been in. There was a pillow and a mattress on the plank bed, and a stool to sit on. They had given him a bath, and they allowed him to wash himself fairly frequently in a tin basin. They even gave him warm water to wash with. They had given him new underclothes and a clean suit of overalls. They had dressed his varicose ulcer with soothing ointment. They had pulled out the remnants of his teeth and given him new set of dentures. Weeks or months must have passed. It must have been possible now to keep count of passage of time. If he had felt any interest in doing so, since he was being fed at what appeared to be regular intervals, he was getting, he judged, 3 meals in 24 hours. Sometimes he wondered dimly whether he was getting them by night or by day. The food was surprisingly good, with meat at every third meal. Once there was even a packet of cigarettes. He had no matches, but the never-speaking guard who brought his food would give him a light. The first time he tried to smoke, it made him sick, but he persevered, and spun the packet out for a long time. He smoking half a cigarette after each meal. Ah, right on. I mean, it's a shame he's being brainwashed, but at least he's comfortable, right? Ah, this is chapter 4. Chapter 5 is a doozy. They had given him a white slate with a stump of pencil tied to the corner. At first he made no use of it. Even when he was awake, he was completely torpid. Even if he would lie from one meal to the next almost without stirring, sometimes asleep, sometimes waking into vague reveries in which it was too much trouble to open his eyes, he had long grown used to sleeping with a strong light on his face. It seemed to make no difference, except that one's dreams were more coherent. He dreamed a great deal all through this time, and they were always happy dreams. He was in a golden country, or he was sitting among enormous, glorious, sunlit ruins, with his mother, with Julia, with O'Brien, not doing anything, merely sitting in the sun, talking of peaceful things. Such thoughts as he had when he was awake were mostly about his dreams. He seemed to have lost the power of intellectual efforts. Now the stimulus of pain had been removed. He was not bored. He had no desire for conversation or distraction, merely to be alone, not to be beaten or questioned, to have enough to eat, and to be clean all over was completely satisfying. By degrees he came to spend less time in sleep, but he still felt no impulse to get off the bed. All he cared for was to lie quiet and feel the strength of gathering in his body. He would finger himself here and there, trying to make sure that it was not an illusion that his muscles were growing around her, and his skin tauter. Finally, it was established beyond a doubt that he was growing fatter. His thighs were now definitely thicker than his knees. After that, reluctantly at first, he began exercising himself regularly. In a while, he could walk 3 kilometers, measured by pacing in the cell, and his bowed shoulders were growing straighter. He attempted more elaborate exercises and was astonished and humiliated to find the things that he could and could not do. He could not move out of a walk. He could not hold his stool out of arm's length. He could not stand on one leg without falling over. He squatted down on his knees and found that with the agonizing pains in thigh and calf, he could not lift himself. He could just lift himself to a standing position. He lay flat on his belly and tried to lift his weight by his hands. It was hopeless. He could not raise himself a centimetre. After a few more days, a few more meal times, even that feat was accomplished. A time came when he could do it 6 times running. He began to actually grow proud of his body and to cherish the intermittent belief that his face also growing back to normal. Only when he chanced upon his hand on his bald scalp did he remember the seamed, ruined face that he looked back at him in the mirror. His mind grew more active. He sat down on the plank bed, his back against the wall and the slate on his knee, and set to work deliberately at the task of re-educating himself. He had capitulated, that was agreed. He had capitulated, that was agreed. In reality, as he saw now, he had been ready to capitulate long before he had taken the decision. From the moment when he was inside the Ministry of Love, and yes, even during those minutes when he and Julia had stood helpless while the iron voice from the telescreen told them what to do, he had grasped the frivolity and shallowness of his attempt to set himself free, up against the power of the party. He knew now that for 7 years the thought police had watched him like a beetle under a magnifying glass. There was no physical act, no words spoken aloud, and they had not noticed, no train of thought that they had been able to infer, even the speck of whitish dust under the cover of his diary they had carefully replaced. They had played soundtracks to him, shown him photographs. Some of them were photographs of Julia and himself. Yes, even. He could not fight against the party, not any longer. Besides, the party was in the right. It must be so. How could the immortal collective brain be mistaken? By what external standard could you check its judgments? Sanity was statistical. It was merely a question of learning to think as they thought. Only the pencil felt thick, and awkward in his fingers. He began to write down the thoughts that came into his head. He wrote the first in large clumsy capitals. Freedom is slavery. Then almost without a pause he wrote beneath it, 2 and 2 make 5. But then came a sort of check. His mind, as though shying away from something, seemed unable to concentrate. He knew that he knew what came next, but for the moment he could not recall it. When he did recall it, it was not only by consciously reasoning out what it must be. It had not come of his own accord. He wrote, God is power. He accepted everything. The past was alterable. The past had never been altered. Oceania was at war with East Asia. Oceania had always been at war with East Asia. Jones, Atherton, Rutherford were guilty of the crimes that they were charged with. He had never seen the photograph that disproved their guilt. It had never existed. He had invented it. He remembered remembering contrary things, but those were false memories, products of self-deception. How easy it all was. Only surrender, and everything else followed. It was like swimming against a current that swept you backwards, however hard you struggled, and then suddenly deciding to turn around and go with the current instead of opposing it. Nothing had changed except your own attitude. The predestined thing happened in any case. He hardly knew why he had ever rebelled. Everything was easy, except anything could be true. The so-called laws of nature were nonsense. The law of gravity was nonsense. If I wished, O'Brien had said, I could float off this floor like a soap bubble. Winston worked it out. If he thinks he floats off the floor and I simultaneously think I see him do it, then the thing happens. Suddenly, like a lump of submerged wreckage breaking the surface of the water, the thought burst into his mind. It don't happen. We imagine it. It's a hallucination. He pushed the thought under instantly. The fallacy was obvious. It presupposed that somewhere or other outside oneself there was a real world where real things happened, but how could there be such a world? What knowledge have we of anything, save through our own minds? All happenings are in the mind. Whatever happens in all minds truly happens. That is true. He had no difficulty in disposing of the fallacy, and he was in no danger of succumbing to it. He realized, nevertheless, that it ought never to have occurred to him. The mind should develop a blind spot whenever a dangerous thought presented itself. The process should be automatic, instinctive. Crime stop, they called it in newspeak. He set to He set to work to exercise himself in Crime Stop. He presented himself with propositions. The party says the earth's flat. The party says the ice is heavier than water. And he trained himself in not seeing or not understanding the arguments that contradicted him. It was not easy. It needed great powers of reasoning and improvisation. The arithmetical problems raised, for instance, by such statement as 2 and 2 make 5, were beyond his intellectual grasp. It needed also a sort of athleticism of mind, inability at the moment to make the most delicate use of logic, and at the next to be unconscious of the crudest logical errors. Stupidity, basically be a parent. Stupidity was necessary as intelligence, and as difficult to attain. Yes, stupidity is very hard to attain. There's people out there that seem to walk around completely clueless with the things you see, but you have to actively pull your emotions away, pull your heart down, stop thinking about certain stuff. The homeless guy you pass by every day, you have to ignore that. You have to pretend to yourself, first of all, it's someone you don't know. You can't trust them. The homeless, maybe for a reason, it's their own fault. Maybe they like being there. You don't want to help them, give them money, let them stay with you, get them on their feet, help them get a job. You don't want to help that person, because you've got this idea in your head that, well, danger, stranger danger. That was pushed into you as a child. People my age and upwards anyway. Stranger danger. Yeah. All the while, with one part of his mind, he wondered how soon they would shoot him. Everything depends on yourself, O'Brien had said. But he knew that there was no conscious act by which he could bring it nearer. It might be 10 minutes hence or 10 years. They might keep him for years in solitary confinement. They might send him to a labour camp. They might release him for a while, as they sometimes did. It was perfectly possible that before he was shot, the whole drama of his arrest and interrogation would be enacted all over again. The one certain thing was that death never came at an expected moment. The tradition, the unspoken tradition, somehow you knew it, though you never heard it said, that they shot you from behind, always in the back of the head, without warning, as you walked down a corridor from cell to cell. One day, but one day was not the right expression, just as probably it was in the middle of the night, once he fell into a strange blissful reverie. He was walking down the corridor, waiting for the bullet. He knew that it was coming in another moment. Everything was settled, smoothed out, reconciled. There was no more doubts, no more arguments, no more pain, no more fear. His body was healthy and strong. He walked easily, with a joy of movement and with a feeling of walking in sunlight. He was not any longer in the narrow white corridors of the inner ministry of love. He was in the enormous sunlit passage, a kilometre wide, down which he had seemed to walk in the delirium induced by drugs. He was in the golden country, following the foot track across the old rabbit-cropped pasture. He could feel the short springy turf under his feet and the gentle sunshine on his face. At the edge of the field were the elm trees, faintly staring, and somewhere beyond that was the stream where the dace lay in the green pools under the willows. You know what? After all this time, I have not once checked out the word dace. Suddenly, he startled up with a shock of horror. Horror. What is that, an hour 40 minutes? An hour 45? What page are we on? 352. 40 pages to go. It's almost done. I'll tell you what then, since this is almost done and I've been here for 2 hours, I'm going to take a small break. I'll be back soon. I'll put a song on for you. About 4 minutes. I shouldn't be too long. I shan't be too long. Is that better? Would you prefer I said it like that? All posh and shit. I shan't be a while. Aww. What songs do I like? These are my songs, by the way. Do dip 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 biddy do dip 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 biddy biddy. Huh. This isn't too bad. Yeah, it isn't too bad. Hang on a minute, this is really bad timing now. So, the stream has just decided to start dying. I'll end the stream here. I guess I'll be back in 20 minutes. Give I guess internet time stuff to fix. Unless it's fixed itself now. Has it fixed itself now? It might have fixed itself now. I'm just gonna do that so I can see myself and I'll know whether or not I'm on time. 4, 5. Yeah. So I have a 5-second delay, that's usual. Am I not allowed to play that then? SoundCloud doesn't take that for sure. Don't believe that for a second. That can't have been SoundCloud that does this. Yeah, alright. When this song's over, I'll be back. I think that was just a hitch. Now you see. You see, there's a reason. There's a reason I do that. There's a reason I do the microphone thing. Watch. I thought that was funny. Never mind. Be on the right page for this. The sweat broke out on his backbone. He had heard himself cry aloud. Julia! Julia! Good morning, Julia. It's me, Joe. I just wanted to let you know. Getting to meet you and look at you. My love, Julia! For a moment he had an overwhelming hallucination of her presence. She had seemed to be not merely with him, but inside him. It was as though she had got into the texture of his skin. In that moment he had loved her far more than he had ever done when they were together and free. Also, he knew that somewhere or other she was still alive and needed his help. He lay back on the bed and tried to compose himself. What had he done? How many years had he added to his servitude by that moment of weakness? In another moment he would hear the tramp of boots outside. They could not let such an outburst go unpunished. They would know now, if they had not known before, that he was breaking the agreement he had made with them. He obeyed the party, but he still hated the party. In the old days he had hidden heretical mind beneath an appearance of conformity. Now he had retreated a step further. In the mind he had surrendered, but he had hoped to keep the inner heart inviolate. He knew that he was in the wrong, but he preferred to be in the wrong. They would understand that. O'Brien would understand it. It was all confessed in that single foolish cry. He would have to start all over again. Might take years. He ran a hand over his face, trying to familiarize himself with the new shape. There were deep furrows in his cheeks. The cheekbones felt sharp. The nose flattened. Besides, since last seeing himself in the glass, he had been given a complete set of new teeth. It was not easy to preserve inscrutability when you did not know what your face looked like. In any case, mere control of the features was not enough. For the first time, he perceived that if you once keep a secret, you must also hide it from yourself. Of course. You must know all the while that it is there. But until it is needed, you must never let it emerge into your consciousness in any shape that could be given a name. From now onwards, he must not only think right, he must feel right, dream right, and all the while he must keep his hatred locked up inside him like a ball of matter which was part of himself and yet unconnected with the rest of him, a kind of cyst. One day they would decide to shoot him. You could not tell when it would happen, but a few seconds beforehand it should be possible to guess. It was always from behind, walking down a corridor. 10 seconds would be enough. In that time, the world inside him could turn over, and then suddenly, without a word uttered, without a check in his step, without changing a line of his face, suddenly the camouflage would be down, and bang would go the batteries of his hatred. Hatred would fill him like an enormous roaring flame, and almost in the same instant, bang would go the bullet. Too late or too early, they would have blown his brain to pieces before they could reclaim it. The heretical thoughts would be unpunished, unrepented, out of their reach forever. They would have blown a hole in their own perfection. To die hating them, that was freedom. I mean, I get it. He shut his eyes. It was more difficult than accepting an intellectual discipline. It was a question of degrading himself, mutilating himself. He had got to plunge into the filthiest of filth. That was the most horrible, sickening thing of all. He thought of Big Brother, the enormous face, because of constantly seeing it in posters. He always thought of it being a metre wide. It was a heavy black moustache, and the eyes that followed you to and fro seemed to float into his mind of its own accord. Where were his true feelings towards Big Brother? There was a heavy tramp of boots in the passage. The steel door swung open with a clang. O'Brien walked into the cell. Behind him there were waxen-faced officer. The waxen-faced officer and the black uniformed guards. "Get up," said O'Brien. "Come here." Winston stood up opposite him. O'Brien took Winston's shoulders between his strong hands and looked at him closely. "You have had thoughts of deceiving me," he said. "That was stupid. Stand up straighter. Look me in the face." He paused, then went on in a gentler tone. "You are improving. Intellectually, there is very little wrong with you. It is only emotionally that you have failed to make progress. Tell me, Winston, and remember, no lies. You know that I'm always able to detect a lie. Tell me, what are your true feelings towards Big Brother?" "I hate him." "You hate him? Good, good. The time has come for you to take the last step. You must love Big Brother. It is not enough to obey him. You must love him." Ooh. Tense? Tense much? Alright. So this O'Brien character, this brotherhood stuff, you see, this is purely a political book. This is purely political. None of this goes towards economics. It doesn't go towards policing. It doesn't go towards other stuff like that. Because as soon as the war changes, everyone's allowed to riot and destroy. Why? Because it creates more jobs and keeps every motherfucker busy. That's all jobs are, by the way. Jobs are there to keep you busy, to stop you thinking. That's it. If you're going to do a job, I suggest you do a job you like and you do it when you like. If you want to get paid that week and have some extra cash, then do a job. That's what it should be. We should all live free. Because there is so much money in the world. So much fucking money in the world. And like 10 people have it. 10 people have our money. It's our money. It's called social economics for a reason. And you can't have economics without it being, you know, economical. What point, please explain to me, what point is there giving money to Jeff Bezos for Amazon when that money does not go back into the workforce, does not go back into the supply of goods, does not go back into society at all, sits in his bank. It sits in his bank. And now he's got our money. I can keep going with all the rich people. And they are so rich, that they are inevitably going to be noticed. And all those super rich people, why have they got that money? Because they do a thing, and they, instead of charging the actual price for the thing, they charge like an upmarked 400% price of it, maybe 1,000. So if you're buying something for, let's say, $3 or £3, you can guarantee that thing is worth probably a quid, maybe less, probably, you know, in all of its creation. From the people working on it, en masse. One by one, it's probably going to be about that much. But it's not one by one, it's made en masse. I don't get it. And how are you supposed to love Big Brother when you can see the things he's doing to the people around you? Then again, if you stop considering the people around you and you must love Big Brother, then I suppose that takes away the idea of camaraderie. I don't think they call themselves comrade in the movie. I do need to watch that film now. I'll finish the book and then I'll watch the film. He released Winston with a little push towards the guards. "Room 101, he said. Now this is where I came into the book. This is the moment. This is the thing. This is what got my attention. I know it's chapter 5. Oh yes. Oh, chapter 5. This gets tense. This had me right on the edge of my seat. I really do like chapter 5. I'll let you read a little bit of it though. You can read that much. There you go. At each stage of I'll give it another try in a minute. at each stage of his imprisonment. Oh, I like need to crack my back or something. I've got like this stiffness and I can't get rid of it. I think the Viagra got stuck. That's a joke. Never mind. At each stage of his imprisonment, he had known, or seemed to know, whereabouts he was in the windowless building. Possibly there were slight differences in the air pressure. The cells where the guards had beaten him were below ground level. The room where he had been interrogated by O'Brien was high up near the roof. The place was many meters underground, as deep down as it were possible to go. It was bigger than most of the cells he had been in, but he hardly noticed his surroundings. Huh. How about that? All he noticed was that there were two small tables straight in front of him, each covered with agreed baize. One was only a meter or two from him, the other was further away near the door, where he was strapped. He was strapped upright in a chair, so tightly he could move nothing. Not even his head. A sort of pad gripped his head from behind, forcing him to look straight in front of him. For a moment he was alone. The door opened and O'Brien came in. "You asked me once," said O'Brien, "what was in room 101. I told you you knew the answer already. Everyone knows it. The thing that is in room 101 is the worst thing in the world." The door opened again. A guard came in. I'm going to have to prepare to speak quite a lot here. Oh, I'm going to have to prepare to speak quite a lot. Give me a minute. A guard came in, carrying something made of a wire, a box or a basket of some kind. He set it down on the further table. Because of the position in which O'Brien was standing, Winston could not see what the thing was. "The worst thing in the world," said O'Brien, "varies from individual to individual. It might be burial alive, or death by fire, or by drowning, or by impalement, or 50 other deaths. There are cases where it is some quite trivial thing, or not even fatal." So he's had this dream, Winston, throughout this story. He's had this dream where there's something on the other side of a wall, and he's always declared it as his greatest fear. Whatever it is, and he refuses to go. I think he's gonna let slip here. He had moved a little to one side so that Winston had a better view of the thing on the table. It was an oblong wire cage with a handle on top for carrying it. Fixed by the front of it was something that looked like a fencing mask, with the concave side outwards. Although it was 3 or 4 meters away from him, he could see that the cage was divided lengthways into 2 compartments, and that there was some kind of creature in each. They were rats. "In your case," said O'Brien, "the worst thing in the world happens to be rats." A sort of premonitory tremor of fear, was not certain what, had passed through Winston as soon as he caught his first glimpse of the cage, but at this moment the meaning of the mask-like attachment in front of it suddenly sank into him. His bowels seemed to turn to water. "You can't do that," he cried out in a high cracked voice. You couldn't, it's impossible." "Do you remember," said O'Brien, "the moment of panic that used to occur in your dreams? There was a wall of blackness in front of you, and a roaring sound in your ears." "Oh yeah, told ya." "There was something terrible on the other side of the wall. You knew that you knew what it was, but you dared not drag it into the open. It was the rats that were on the other side of the wall." "O'Brien," said Winston, making an effort to control his voice, "you know this is not necessary. What is it that you want me to do?" O'Brien made no direct answer. When he spoke, it was in the schoolmasterish manner that he sometimes affected. O'Brien's really giving it to him, isn't he? Doing his best. He looked thoughtfully into the distance as though he were addressing an audience somewhere behind Winston's back. By itself, he said, pain is not always enough. There are occasions when a human being will stand out against pain, even to the point of death. But for everyone, there is something unendurable, something that cannot be contemplated. Courage and cowardice are not involved. If you are falling from a height, it is not cowardly to clutch at your rope. If you come up from the deep water, it is not cowardly to fill your lungs with air. It is merely an instinct which cannot be destroyed. It is the same with rats. For you, they are unendurable. They are a form of pressure that you cannot withstand. Even if you wish to, you will do what is required of you. But what is it? What is it? How can I do it if I don't know what it is? O'Brien picked up the cage and brought it across to the nearer table. He set it down carefully on the baize cloth. Winston could hear the blood singing in his ears. He had the feeling of sitting in utter loneliness. He was in the middle of a great empty plain, a flat desert drenched with sunlight, across which all sounds came to him out of the immense distances, yet the cage with the rats was not 2 meters away from him. They were enormous rats. They were at the age where a rat's muzzle grows blunt, and fierce, and is fair brown instead of grey. The rat, said O'Brien, still addressing his invisible audience, although a rodent is carnivorous, you are aware of that. You will have heard of things that happen in the poor quarters of this town. In some streets, the women dare not leave their baby alone in the house, even for 5 minutes. The rats are certain to attack it. Within quite a small time, they will strip it to the bones. They will also attack sick or dying people. They show astonishing intelligence in knowing when a human being is helpless. There was an outburst of squeals from the cage. It seemed to reach Winston from far away. The rats were fighting. They were trying to get at each other through the partition. He heard also a deep groan of despair. That too seemed to come from outside himself. O'Brien picked up the cage, and as he did so, pressed something in it. There was a sharp click. Winston made a frantic effort to tear himself loose from the chair. It was hopeless. Every part of him, even his head, was held immovably. O'Brien moved the cage nearer. It was less than a meter from Winston's face. I've pressed the first lever, said O'Brien. You understand the construction of this cage. The mask will fit over your head, leaving no exit. When I press the other lever, the door of the cage will slide up. These starving brutes will shoot out of it like bullets. Have you ever seen a rat leap through the air? They will leap onto your face and bore straight into it. Sometimes they attack the eyes first. Sometimes they burrow through the cheeks and devour the tongue. The cage was nearer. It was closing in. Winston heard a succession of shrill cries which appeared to be occurring in the air above his head. He fought furiously against his panic. To think even with a split second left, to think was the only hope. Suddenly, the foul musty odour of the brute struck his nostrils. There was a violent convulsion of nausea inside him, and he almost lost consciousness. Everything had gone black. For an instant, he was insane, a screaming animal, yet he came out of the blackness clutching an idea. There was one and only one way to save himself. He must interpose another human being, the body of another human being between himself and the rats. The circle of the mask was large enough now to shut out the vision of anything else. The wire door was a couple of handspans from his face. The rats knew what was coming now. One of them was leaping up and down. The other, an old scaly grandfather of the sewers, stood up with his pink hands against the bars and fiercely sniffed the air. Winston could see the whiskers and the yellowish teeth. Again, the black panic took hold of him. He was blind, helpless, mindless. It was common punishment in Imperial China, said O'Brien, as didactically as ever. The mask was closing on his face. The wire brushed his cheek, and then, no. It was not relief, only hope, a tiny fragment of hope, too late, perhaps too late, but he had suddenly understood that in the whole world there was just one person to whom he could transfer his punishment, one body that he could thrust between himself and the rats, and he was shouting frantically over and over, "Do it to Julia! Do it to Julia, not me, Julia! I don't care what you do to her. Tear her face off, strip her to the bones. Not me, Julia. Not me. He was falling backwards into enormous depths, away from the rats. He was still strapped to the chair, but he had fallen through the floor, through the walls of the building, through the air, through the oceans, through the atmosphere, into outer space, into the gulfs between the stars, always away from the rats. He was light years distant, but O'Brien was still standing at his side. There was still the cold touch of the wire against his cheek, but through the darkness that enveloped him, he heard another metallic click, and he knew that the cage door had clicked shut and not open. Now, that's all I'd read at that point, and I believe chapter 6 might be the end. 30 pages left. That's mad. Kind of feel bad for Winston just a little bit, don't you? Good morning, Julia. It's me, Winston. The chestnut tree was almost empty. A ray of sunlight slanting through a window fell on dusty tabletops. It was the lonely hour of 15. A tinny music trickled from the telescreens. Winston sat in his usual corner, gazing into an empty glass. Now and again he glanced up at the fast face which eyed him from the opposite wall. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption said. Unbidden, a waiter came and filled his glass up with Victory gin, shaking into it a few drops from another bottle with a quill through the cork. Was saccharine flavoured with cloves, the speciality of the cafe. Winston was listening to the telescreen. At presently, only music was coming out of it, but there was a possibility that any moment there might be a special bulletin from the Ministry of Peace. The news from the African front was disquieting in the extreme. On and off he had been worrying about it all day. A Eurasian army, Oceania was at war with Eurasia. Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia, was moving southward at terrifying speed. The midday bulletin had not mentioned any definite area, but it was probable that already the mouth of the Congo was a battlefield. Brazzaville and Leopoldville were in danger. One did not have to look at the map to see what it meant. It was not merely a question of losing Central Africa. For the first time in the whole war, the territory of Oceania itself was menaced. The violent emotion, not fear exactly, but a sort of indifferentiated excitement, not flared up in him, then faded again. He stopped thinking about the war. In these days, he could never fix his mind on any one subject for more than a few moments at a time. I'm starting to feel like him. This is getting worse and worse. It's a few pages, man. Concentrate. He picked up his glass and drained it at a gulp. As always, the gin made him shudder and even retch slightly. Should that have a W there? Maybe. Never mind. The stuff was horrible. The cloves and saccharine themselves, disgusting enough in their sickly way, could not disguise the flat, oily smell, and what was worst of all was the smell of the gin, which dwelt with him in night and day, was inextricably mixed up in his mind with the smell of those. He never named them, but in his thoughts, and so far was it possible, he never visualized them. There was something that he was half aware of, hovering close to his face, a smell that clung to his nostrils as the gin rose in him, belched through with purple lips. He had grown fatter since they released him. He had regained his old colour. Indeed, more than regained it, his features had thickened. The skin on his nose and cheekbones were coarsely red. Even the bald scalp was too deep and pink. A waiter, again unbidden, brought the chessboard and the current issue of the Times, with the page turned down and chess problem. Then, seeing that Winston's glass was empty, he brought the bottle of gin and filled it. There was no need to give orders. They knew his habits. This chessboard was always waiting for him. His corner table was always reserved. Even when the place was full, he had it to himself, since nobody cared to be seen sitting close to him. He never even bothered to count his drinks. At irregular intervals, they presented him with a dirty slip of paper which they said was the bill, but he had the impression that they always undercharged him. It would have made no difference. It had been the other way around. He had always plenty of money nowadays. He even had a job as sinecure, more highly paid than his old job had been. The music from the telescreen stopped and a voice took over. Winston raised his head to listen. No bulletins from the front, however. It was merely a brief announcement from the Ministry of Plenty. In the preceding quarter, it appeared that the 10th three-year quarter plan for bootlaces had been overfulfilled by 98%. He examined the chess problem and set out the pieces. It was a tricky ending, involving a couple of knights. White to play and mate in 2 moves. Winston looked up at the portrait of Big Brother. White always mates, he thought with a sort of cloudy mysticism. Always without exception, it is so arranged. In no chess problem since the beginning of the world has black ever won. Did it not symbolize the eternal unvarying triumph of good over evil? The huge face gazed back at him, full of calm power. White always mates. The voice from the telescreen paused and added, in different, a much graver tone. You are warned to stand by an important announcement at 15:30. 15:30. This is news of the highest importance. Take care not to miss it. 15:30. The tinkling music struck up again. Winston's heart stirred. That was the bulletin from the front. Instinct told him that it was bad news that was coming. All day, with little spurts of excitement, the thought of smashing defeat in Africa had been in and out of his mind. He seemed actually to see the Eurasian army as swarming across the never-broken frontier and pouring down into the tip of Africa like a column of ants. Why it had not been possible to outflank them in some way, the outline of the West African coast stood out vividly in his mind. He picked up the white knight and moved it across the board. There was a proper spot, even while he saw the black horde racing toward southward. He saw another fence, mysteriously assembled, suddenly planted in the rear, cutting their communications by land and sea. He felt that by willing, he was bringing the other force into existence. But it was necessary to act quickly. If they could get control of the whole of Africa, if they had airfields and submarine bases at the Cape, it would cut Oceania in 2. It might mean anything. Defeat, breakdown, the redivision of the world, the destruction of the party. He drew a deep breath, an extraordinary medley of feeling. But it was not a medley exactly. Rather, it was successive layers of feeling, in which one could not say which layer was undermost, struggled inside of him. The spasm passed. He put the white knight back in its place, but for the moment he could not settle down the serious study of the chess problem. His thoughts wandered again. Almost unconsciously, he traced his finger in the dust of the table. They can't get inside you, she had said, but they could get inside you. Whatever happens to you here is forever, O'Brien had said. That was a true word. There were feelings. There were things, your own acts from which you could not recover. Something was killed in your breast, burnt out, cauterized out. He had seen her, he had even spoken to her. There was no danger in it. He knew as though instinctively that they had now took almost no interest in his doings. I'm going to stop at that sentence. Give me a minute. Oh. Fatigue, you know it goes. Oh. He could not have arranged to meet her a second time if either of them had wanted to. Actually, it was by chance that they had met. It was in the park, on a vile, biting day in March, when the earth was like iron and all the grass seemed dead and there was no bud anywhere except a few crocuses which had pushed themselves up to be dismembered by the wind. He was hurrying along with frozen hands and watering eyes when he saw her not 10 meters away from him. It struck him at once that she had changed in some ill-defined way. They almost passed one another without a sign. Then he turned and followed her, not very eagerly. He knew that there was no danger. Nobody would take any interest in him. She did not speak. She walked obliquely away across the grass, as though trying to get rid of him. Then seemed to resign herself to having him at her side. Presently they were in among a clump of ragged leafless shrubs, useless either for concealment or as protection from the wind. They halted. It is vilely cold. The wind whistled through the twigs and fretted the occasional dirty-looking crocuses. Whatever. He put his arm around her waist. There was no telescreen, but there must be hidden microphones. Besides, they could be seen. It did not matter. Nothing mattered. They could have lain down on the ground and done that if they wanted to. His flesh froze with horror at the thought of it. She made no response whatever to the clasp of his arm. She did not even try to disengage herself. He knew now that what had changed in her. Her face was sallower, and there was a long scar, partly hidden by the hair across her forehead and temple. But that was not the change. It was rather that her waist had grown thicker and in a surprising way had stiffened. He remembered how once, after the explosion of a rocket bomb, that he had helped drag a corpse out of some ruins, and had been astonished not only by the incredible weight of the thing, but by its rigidity and awkwardness to handle, which made it seem more like stone than flesh. Her body felt like that. It occurred to him that the texture of her skin would be quite different from what it had once been. He did not attempt to kiss her, nor did they speak as they walked back across the grass. She looked directly at him for the first time. It was only a momentary glance, full of contempt and dislike. He wondered whether it was dislike that came purely out of the past, or whether it was inspired also by his bloated face and the water that the wind kept squeezing from his eyes. They sat on two iron chairs side by side, but not too close together. He saw that she was about to speak. She moved her clumsy shoe a few centimeters and deliberately crushed a twig. Her feet seemed to have grown broader, he noticed. "I betrayed you," she said baldly. "I betrayed you," he said. She gave him another quick look of dislike. "Sometimes," she said, "they threaten you with something you can't stand up to and you can't even think about, and then you say, 'Don't do it to me. Do it to somebody else. Do it to so-and-so.' And perhaps you might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. But it isn't true. At the time when it happens, you do mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself." "All you care about is yourself," he echoed. "And after that, you don't feel the same towards the other person any longer." "No," he said, "you don't feel the same." There did not seem to be anything more to say. The wind plastered their thin overalls against their bodies. Almost at once it became embarrassing to sit in silence. Besides, it was too cold to keep still. They said something about catching her tube, and she stood up to go. "We must meet again," he said. "Yes," she said, "we must meet again." He followed irresolutely for a little distance, half a pace behind her. They did not speak again. She did not actually try to shake him off, but walked at just such a speed as to prevent his keeping abreast of her. He had made up his mind that he would accompany her as far as the tube station. But suddenly, this process of trailing along in the cold seemed pointless and unbearable. He was overwhelmed by a desire not so much to get away from Julia as to get back to the Chestnut Tree Cafe, which had never seemed so attractive at this moment. He had a nostalgic vision of his corner table with a newspaper in the chessboard and the ever-flowing gin. Above all, it would be warm in there. The next moment, not altogether by accident, he allowed himself to become separated from her by a small knot of people. He made a half-hearted attempt to catch up, then slowed down, then turned and made off in the opposite direction. When he had gone 50 meters, he looked back. The street was not crowded, but already he could not distinguish her. Any one of a dozen hurrying figures might have been hers. Perhaps her thickened, stiffened body was no longer recognizable from behind. Yeah, I suppose. She's not wearing that sash anymore, is she? "At the time when it happens," she had said, "you do mean it." And he had meant it. He had not merely said it, he had wished it. He had wished that she had not only... He had wished that she had not, and she had delivered over to the... Something changed in the music that trickled from the telescreen. A cracked and jeering note, a yellow note, came into it, and then, perhaps it was not happening. Perhaps it was merely a memory, taking on the semblance of sound. A voice was singing. "Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me." The tears welled up in his eyes. A passing waiter noticed that his glass was empty and came back with a gin bottle. He took up his glass and sniffed at it. The stuff grew not less, but more horrible with every mouthful he drank. But it had become the element he swam in. It was his life, his death, and his resurrection. It was gin that sank him into a stupor every night, and gin that revived him every morning. When he awoke, seldom before 1100, with gummed-up eyelids and fiery mouth and back that seemed to be broken, it would have been impossible to even rise from the horizontal if it had not been for the bottle and teacup placed beside the bed overnight. I said bedside, it's the same. Though the midday hours he sat with glazed face, the bottle handy, listening to the telescreen from 15 to closing time, was a fixture in the chestnut tree. No one cared what he did any longer. No whistle woke him, no telescreen admonished him. Occasionally, perhaps twice a week, he went to a dusty, forgotten-looking office in the Ministry of Truth and did a little work, or what was called work. He had been appointed a subcommittee of subcommittee, which had sprouted from one of the innumerable committees dealing with the minor difficulties that arose in the compilation of the 11th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary. They were engaged in producing so-called the interim report, but what it was that they were reporting on had never definitely found out. It was something to do with the question of whether commas should be placed inside brackets or outside. There were four other. Wait. Why would you put a comma and then put brackets outside? Or in, how would you put commas outside brackets? There were four others on the committee, all of them persons similar to himself. There were days when they assembled and then promptly dispersed again, frankly admitting to one another that there was not really anything to be done. Excuse me. But there were other days when they settled down to their work almost eagerly, making a tremendous show of entering up their minutes and drafting long memoranda, which were never finished, when their argument as to what they were supposedly arguing about grew extraordinarily involved and abstruse, with subtle haggling over definitions, enormous digressions and quarrels, threats, even to appeal to higher authority. And then suddenly the life would go out of them, and they would sit down at the table looking at one another with extinct eyes, like ghosts fading at a cockcrow. Ah, man. The telescreen was silent for a moment. Winston raised his head again. The bulletin! But no, they were merely changing the music. He had the map of Africa behind his eyelids. How'd you do that without Big Brother noticing? The movement of the armies was a diagram, a black arrow tearing vertically southward and a white arrow horizontally eastward, across the tail of the first. As though for a reassurance, he looked up at the imperturbable face in the portrait. It was conceivable that the second arrow did not even exist. His interest flagged again. He drank another mouthful of gin, picked up the white knight and made a tentative move. Check. But it was evidently not the right move, because uncalled, a memory floated in his mind. He saw a candle-lit room with a vast white counterpaned bed, and himself, a boy of 9 or 10, sitting on the floor, shaking a dice box and laughing excitedly. His mother was sitting opposite him and also laughing. It must have been about a month before she disappeared. It was a moment of reconciliation when the nagging hunger in his belly was forgotten and his earlier affection for her temporarily revived. He remembered the day well, a pelting, drenching day, when the water streamed down the window pane and the light indoors was too dull to read by. The boredom of the two children in the dark, cramped bedroom became unbearable. Winston whined and grizzled, made futile demands for food, fretted about the room, pulling everything out of place, and kicking and wainscoting until neighbours banged on the wall, while the younger child wailed intermittently. In the end, his mother said, "Now be good, or I'll buy you a toy. A lovely toy, you'll love it." And then she had gone out in the rain to a little general shop, which was still sporadically open nearby, and came back with a cardboard box containing an outfit of snakes and ladders. He could still remember the smell of the damp cardboard. It was a miserable outfit. The board was cracked and the tiny wooden dice were so ill cut that they could hardly lie on their sides. Winston looked at this thing sulkily and without interest. But then his mother lit a piece of candle and they sat down on the floor to play. Soon he was wildly excited and shouting with laughter as the tiddlywinks climbed hopefully up the ladders and then came slithering down the snakes again. Almost to the starting point. They played 8 games, winning 4 each. His tiny sister, too young to understand what the game was about, had sat propped up against a bolster, laughing because the others were laughing. For a whole afternoon they all had been happy together, as in his early childhood. Ah, cool. He pushed the picture out of his mind. It was a false memory. He was troubled by false memories occasionally. They did not matter so long as one knew them for what they are. Some things had happened. Others had not happened. He turned his back to the chessboard and picked up the white knight again. Almost in the same instant, it dropped on the board with a clatter. He had started although the pin had run into him. I mean, the language in this is difficult enough, don't you think? A shrill trumpet call had pierced the air. It was the bulletin. Victory! It was always meant victory when a trumpet call preceded the news. A sort of electric drill ran through the cafe. Even the waiters had started and pricked up their ears. A trumpet call had let loose an enormous volume of noise. Already an excited voice was gabbling from the telescreen, but even as it started it was almost drowned by a roar of cheering from the inside. The news had run round the streets like magic. He could hear just enough of what was issuing from the telescreen to realise it had all happened as he had foreseen. The vast seaborne armada had secretly assembled a sudden blow to the enemy's rear. The white arrow tearing across the tail of the black. Fragments of triumphant phrases pushed themselves through the din. Vast strategic maneuver. Perfect coordination. Oh, sorry. Utter rout. Utter rout? Rout. About 500,000 prisoners. Complete demoralization. Control of the whole of Africa. Bring the war within measurable distance of its end. Victory. Greatest victory in human history. Victory. 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 Under the table, Winston's feet made convulsive movements. He had not stirred from his seat, but in his mind he was running, swiftly running. He was with the crowds outside, cheering himself deaf. He looked up again at the portrait of Big Brother, the colossus that bestrode the world, the rock against which the hordes of Asia dashed themselves in vain. He thought how 10 minutes ago, yes, only 10 minutes ago, there had still been equivocation in his heart as he wondered whether the news from the front would be victory or defeat. Ah, it was more than the Eurasian army that had perished. Much had changed in him since the first day in the Ministry of Love, but the final, indispensable healing change had never happened until this moment. The voice from this telescreen was still pouring forth its tale of prisoners and booty and slaughter, but the shouting outside had died down a little. The waiters were turning back to their work. One of them approached with the gin bottle. Winston was sitting in a blissful dream, paid no attention as his glass was filled up. He was not running or cheering any longer. He was back in the Ministry of Love, with everything forgiven, his soul white as snow. He was in the public dock, confessing everything, implicating everybody. He was walking down the white tiled corridor with the feeling of walking in sunlight, and an armed guard at his back. A long hoped for a bullet that was entering his brain. He gazed up at the enormous face. 40 years it had taken him to learn what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark moustache. Oh, cruel, needless misunderstanding. Oh, stubborn, self-willed exile from the loving breast. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose, but it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. The end. Appendix. The principles of newspeak. There we go. That's it. It's finished. It's finished. Done. Finished. Right, we'll read the rest now. Newspeak is the official language of Oceania. It has been devised to meet the ideological needs of English socialism. In the year 1984, it was not as yet anyone who used Newspeak as his sole means of communication, either in speech or in writing. The leading articles in the Times were written in it but this was a tour de force which could only be carried out by a specialist. It was expected that newspeak would have finally superseded old speak, or standard English as we should call it, by about the year 2050. Oh yeah, that's not happening right now, is it? Meanwhile, it gained steadily, all party members tending to use newspeak words and grammatical constructions more and more in their everyday speech. The version in use in 1984 and embodied in the 9th and 10th editions of the Newspeak Dictionary was a provisional one, and contained many superfluous words and archaic formations which were due to be suppressed later. It is with the final perfected version as embodied in the 11th edition of the dictionary that we are concerned here. The purpose of newspeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the world view and mental habits proper to the devotees of Ingsoc, but to make all other modes of thought impossible. It was intended that when newspeak had been adopted once and for all, and old speak forgotten, a heretical thought, that is, a thought diverging from the principles of Ingsoc, should be literally unthinkable, at least so far as the thought dependent on its words. Its vocabulary was so constructed as to give exact and often very subtle expressions of every meaning that a party member could properly wish to express, while excluding all other meanings and also a possibility of arriving at them by indirect methods. This was done partly by the invention of new words, but chiefly by eliminating undesirable words and by stripping such words as remained of unorthodox meanings, and so far as possible of all secondary meanings whatever. To give a single example, the word free still existed in newspeak, but it could only be used in such statements as the dog is free from lice, or this field is free from weeds. It could not be used in its old sense of politically free or intellectually free, since political and intellectual freedom no longer existed even as concepts, and were therefore of necessity nameless. Quite apart from the suppression of the definitely heretical words, reduction of vocabulary was regarded as an end in itself, and no word that could be dispensed with what was allowed to survive. Newspeak was designed not to extend but to diminish the range of thought, and this purpose was indirectly assisted by cutting the choice of words down to a minimum. I don't see that happening today. Newspeak was founded on the English language as we now know it, though many newspeak sentences, even when not containing newly created words, would be barely intelligible to an English speaker of our own day. Newspeak words were divided into 3 distinct classes, known as the A vocabulary, the B vocabulary, also called the compound words, and the C vocabulary. It will be simpler to discuss each class separately, but the grammatical peculiarities of the language can be dealt with in the section devoted to A vocabulary, since the same rules held good for 3 categories. The A vocabulary. It consisted of the words needed for the business of everyday life, for such things as eating, drinking, working, putting on one's clothes, going up and down the stairs, riding in vehicles, gardening, cooking, and the like. It was composed almost entirely of words that we already possess, words like hit, run, dog, tree, sugar, house, feel, but in comparison with the present-day English vocabulary, their number was extremely small, with their meanings were far more rigidly defined. All ambiguities and shades of meaning had been purged out of them, so far as it could be achieved. A newspeak word of this class was simply a staccato sound, expressing one clearly understood concept. It would have been quite impossible to use the A vocabulary for literary purposes or for political or philosophical discussion. It was intended only to express simple, purposive thoughts, usually involving a concrete objects or physical actions. The grammar of newspeak had 2 outstanding peculiarities. The first of these was an almost complete interchangeability between different parts of speech. Any word in a language, in principle, this applied to very abstract words such as if or when could be used either as verb, noun, adjective, or adverb. Between the verb and the noun form, when they were the same root, there was never any variation, the rule of itself involving a destruction of many archaic forms. The word thought, for example, did not exist in newspeak. Its place was taken by think, which did duty for both noun and verb. No etymological principle was followed here. In some cases, it was the original noun that was chosen for retention. In other cases, the verb, even where the noun and verb kindred meaning were not etymologically connected, one another of them was frequently suppressed. There was, for example, no word such as cut, its meaning being sufficiently covered by the noun verb knife. Adjectives were formed by adding suffix full to the noun verb and adverbs to the adding was. Thus, for example, speedful meant rapid and speedwise meant quickly. Certain to our present day adjectives such as good, strong, big, black, soft. What are you thinking about? Come on, Orwell. I'm starting to see a little bit into your head here. Were retained, but their total number was very small. There was a little need for them, since almost any adjectival meaning could be arrived at by adding full to a noun verb. None of the now existing adverbs was retained, except for a few, very few already ending in was. The was termination was invariable. The word well, for example, was replaced with good was. Oh wow, so you don't wish someone well, you wish them good was. That's interesting. In addition, any word, this again applied in principle to every word in a language, could be negatived by adding the affix un, or could be strengthened by the affix plus, or for its still greater emphasis, double plus. Thus, for example, uncold meant warm, while plus cold meant double plus, and double plus cold meant respectively very cold, and superlatively cold. It was also very cold and superlatively cold. It was also possible, as in present-day English, to modify the meaning of almost any word by prepositional affixes such as anti, post, up, down, etc. By such methods, it was found possible to bring out an enormous diminution of vocabulary. Given, for instance, the word good, there was no need for such a word as bad, since the required meaning was equally, well indeed, better expressed by ungood. All that was necessary in any case, where two words formed a neutral pair of opposites, was to decide which of them to suppress. Dark, for example, could be replaced by unlight, or light could be replaced by undark, according to preference. The second distinguishing mark of newspeak grammar was its regularity. Oh, I need a drink. Oh, this is getting harder. The book's finished, by the way. We're just discussing newspeak now. We'll finish the book. He ends up getting brainwashed. He's fucked. Didn't mean to spoil it, but I mean, if you're watching this, you're already too late, so yeah. Spoiled! Subject to a few exceptions, which are mentioned below, all inflections follow the same rules. Thus, in all verbs, the preterite and the past participle were the same and ended in ed. The preterite of steal was stealed. The preterite of think was thinked, and so on and throughout the language. All such forms of swam, gave, brought, spoke, taken, etc., etc., being abolished. All plurals were made by adding s or es, as the cases might be. The plurals of man, ox, life were mans, oxes, and lifes. Comparison of adjectives was invariably made by adding est, gooder, gooder, goodest. Regular forms of the more, most formation being suppressed. The only classes of words that were still allowed to inflect irregularly were the pronouns, the relatives, the demonstrative adjectives, the auxiliary verbs. All of these followed their ancient usage, except that whom had been scrapped as unnecessary, and the shall, should tenses should have been dropped, and all their uses being covered by will and would. Finally, there's no more whom bullshit. Sorry, I thought that was funny. There was also certain irregularities in word formation arising out of the need for rapid and easy speech. A word which was difficult to utter or was liable to incorrectly be heard was held to be ipso facto a bad word. Occasionally, therefore, the sake of euphony, extra letters were inserted into a word, or an archaic formation was retained. But this need made itself felt chiefly in connection with the B vocabulary. Why so greatly in importance was attached to ease of pronunciation will be made clear later in this essay. God, this is a fucking essay. The B vocabulary consisted of words which had been deliberately constructed for political purposes, words that is to say, which not only had in every case a political implication, but were intended to impose a desirable mental attitude upon the person using them. Without a full understanding of the principles of Ingsoc, it was difficult to use these words correctly. In some cases, they would be translated into Old Speak, or even to words taken from the A vocabulary, but this usually demanded a long paraphrase and was always involved the loss of certain overtones. The B words were a sort of verbal shorthand, often packing whole ranges of ideas into a few syllables, and at the same time more accurate and forcible than ordinary language. The B words were in all cases compound words. Compound words such as speak right were of course to be found in the A vocabulary, but these words were merely convenient abbreviations and had no special ideological colour. They consisted of two or more words or portions of words welded together in an easily pronounceable form. The resulting amalgam was always a noun verb, and inflected according to the ordinary rules. To take the single example, the word good think, meaning very roughly orthodoxy, or if one chose to regard it as a verb, to think in an orthodox manner, this inflected as follows: noun verb, good think. Past tense and past participle, good thinked. Pretense and the pretense participle is good thinking. Adjective is good thinkful, the adverb is good think was, and the verbal noun is good thinker. The B words were not constructed on any etymological plan. The words of which they were made up could be or any parts of speech, and could be placed in any order and mutilated in any way which made them easy to pronounce, while indicating their derivation. In the word crime think, thought crime for instance, the think came second, whereas the think police, it came first. And in the latter word, police had lost its second syllable because of the great difficulty in securing euphony. Irregular formations were commoner in the B vocabulary than in the A vocabulary. For example, the adjective forms of mini-true, mini-pax, and mini-love were respectively mini-truthful, mini-peaceful, and mini-lovely. Simply because truthful, paxful, and loveful were slightly awkward to pronounce. In principle, however, all B words could inflect, and all inflected in exactly the same way. Some of the B words had highly subtilized meanings, barely intelligible to anyone who had not mastered the language as a whole. Consider, for example, such a typical sentence from a Times leading article as "Old thinkers unbelly feeling sock." Oh wow, so people who think the old way don't have the internal love for the English socialism. The shortest rendering, sorry, I just tried to decipher that. The shortest rendering that one could make of this old speak would be: those whose ideas were formed before the revolution cannot have a full emotional understanding of the principles of English socialism. Yes, see? Ingsoc all the way. Yes, Ingsoc. Isn't that what they do that? In that the thing? I can't remember. I ain't seen the book. Seen the book, seen the movie, I'm reading it. I've read the book. Are you fucking kidding me? I've just finished it. Don't tell anyone I said that. And in addition, only a person thoroughly grounded in insight could appreciate the full force of the word belly feel. I don't feel it, but I guess I understand what it means, which implied a bland, enthusiastic acceptance difficult to imagine today, or the word old think, which was inextricably mixed up with the idea of wickedness and decadence. But the special function of certain newspeak words, of which old think was one, was not much to express meanings as to destroy them. These words necessary, so it's like calling someone a Nazi. Oh, old thinker. Ah, you're a fucking Nazi, aren't you? Yeah, it's that. That's what they're doing. Oh, it's interesting how accurate this is. Oh, the book was, and I'm just reading definitions of old speak now. These words, necessarily few in number, had their meanings extended until they contained within themselves whole batteries of words which, as they were sufficiently covered by a single comprehensive term, could now be scrapped and forgotten. The greatest difficulty facing the compilers of the Newspeak Dictionary was not to invent new words, but having invented them to make sure what they meant, to make sure, that is to say, what ranges of words they cancelled by their existence. As we have already seen in the case of the word free, words which had once borne a heretical meaning were sometimes retained for the sake of convenience, but only with the undesirable meanings purged out of them. Countless other words such as honour, justice, morality, internationalism, democracy, science, and religion had simply ceased to exist. A few blanket words covered them, and in covering them abolished them. All words grouping themselves round the concepts of liberty and equality, for instance, were contained in a single word. Cram think. Oh, don't post anything on Facebook. You don't want to be doing any cram think. While all words grouping themselves round the concept of objectivity and rationalism were contained in a single word, old think. Greater precision would have been dangerous. What was required in a party member was an outlook similar to that of an ancient Hebrew who knew, without knowing much else, that all nations other than his own worshipped false gods. He did not need to know that these gods were called Baal, Osiris, Moloch, Ashtaroth, and the like. Probably, the less he knew about them, the better for his orthodoxy. He knew Jehovah and the commandments of Jehovah. He knew, therefore, that all gods with other names or other attributes were false gods, in somewhat the same way. Is he calling out Jews as bullshitters? I'm reading a book. I didn't write this. This was written in 1949. I'm just reading what's been written. I mean, there's a reason it's been banned, I guess. Just take the last pages out, if it's upsetting you, but it's true. In somewhat the same way, the party member knew what constituted right conduct, and in exceedingly vague generalized terms, he knew what kinds of departure from it were possible. His sexual life, for example, was entirely regulated by the two newspeak words, sex crime, sexual immorality, and good sex, chastity. Sex crime covered all sexual misdeeds whatsoever. It covered fornication, adultery, homosexuality, other perversions, and in addition, normal intercourse practiced for its own sake. There was no need to enumerate them separately, I've invented a word, separately, since they were all equally culpable and, in principle, all punishable by death. In the C vocabulary, C word, there you go. Do I get demonetized now? I'm kidding, I don't get paid. Which consisted of scientific and technical words. It might be necessary to give specialized names to certain sexual aberrations, but the ordinary citizen had no need of them. He knew what was meant by good sex, that is to say, normal intercourse between man and wife, for the sole purpose of begetting children, and without physical pleasure on the part of a woman. All else was sex crime. Are you doing the... Okay, that sounds like a Jewish thing. In newspeak, it was seldom possible to follow heretical thought further than the perception that it was heretical. Beyond the point that is necessary, words were non-existent. No word in the B vocabulary was ideologically neutral. A great many were euphemisms, such words, for instance, as joy camp, forced labour camp, or mini-packs, ministry of peace, i.e. the ministry of war, meant almost the exact opposite of what they appeared to mean. Some words, on the other hand, displayed a frank and contemptuous understanding of the real nature of oceanic society. An example was prolified, meaning the rubbishy entertainment and spurious news which the party handed out to the masses. Other words, again, were ambivalent, having the connotation good when applied to the party and bad when applied to its enemies. But in addition, there were great numbers of words which at first sight appeared to be mere abbreviations, and which derived their ideological colour not from their meaning, but from their structure. So far as it could be contrived, everything that had or might have political significance of any kind was fitted into the B vocabulary. The name of every organisation or body of people, or doctrine, or country, or institution, or public building was invariably cut down into the familiar shape. That is, a single, easily pronounced word with the smallest number of syllables that would preserve the original derivation. In the Ministry of Truth, for example, the record department in which Winston worked was called the Rec Dep. In Fiction department was called the Fic Dep. The Teleprograms department was called Johnny Depp, Teledep, and so on. And this was not done solely with the object. I'm sorry, I put myself off. Of saving time. Even in the early decades of the 20th century, telescoped words and phrases had been one of the characteristic features of the political language, and it had been noticed that the tendency to use abbreviations of this kind was most marked in totalitarian countries and totalitarian organizations. Examples were such words as Nazi, Gestapo, Comintern, Improcor, Agitprop, yeah, that one. In the beginning, the practice had been adopted as it were instinctively, but in newspeak it was used with a conscious purpose. It was perceived that in thus abbreviating the name, one narrowed a subtly altered its meaning, by cutting out most of the associations that would otherwise cling to it. The words Communist International, for instance, call up a composite picture of universal human brotherhood, red flags, barricades, Karl Marx, the Paris Commune. The word, on the other hand, suggests merely a tightly knit organisation and well-defined body of doctrine. It refers to something almost as easily recognised as limited in purpose as a chair or a table. Comintern is the word that can be uttered almost without taking thought, whereas Communist International is a phrase over which one is obliged to linger, at least momentarily. In the same way, the associations called upon by a word like mini-true are fewer and more controllable than those called upon by the Ministry of Truth. This accounted not only for the habit of abbreviating whenever possible, but also for almost exaggerating care that was taken to make every word easily pronounceable. Oh, I'm glad there isn't such a thing as people making things more grouped together for no particular reason. That's definitely not happening. And they're not making shit easily pronounceable, I'm telling you that much. In newspeak, euphony outweighed every consideration other than exactitude of meaning. Regularity of grammar was also sacrificed to it when it seemed necessary, and rightly so, since it was required. I've got an impediment now. Above all, for political purposes, were short-clipped words of unmistakable meaning, which could be uttered rapidly and which roused the minimum of echoes into the speaker's mind. The words of the B vocabulary even gained in force from the fact that nearly all of them were very much alike. Almost invariably these words, good think, mini-packs, prolifeed, sex cram, joy camp, insock, belly feel, think pol, and countless others, were words of 2 or 3 syllables, with the stress distributed equally between the first syllable and the last. The use of them encouraged a gabbling style of speech, at once staccato and monotonous, and this was exactly what was aimed at. The intention was to make speech, and especially speech on any subject, not ideologically neutral, as nearly as possible as independent of consciousness. For the purpose of everyday life, it was no doubt necessary, or sometimes necessary, to reflect before speaking, but a party member called upon to make a political or ethical judgment should be able to spray forth the correct opinions as automatically as a machine gun spraying forth bullets. His training fitted him to do this. The language gave him an almost foolproof instrument, and the texture of the words, with their harsh sound and certain willful ugliness, which was in accord with the spirit of Ingsoc, assisted the process still further. Oh, look at that. So did the fact of having very few words to choose from relative to our own. The newspeak vocabulary was tiny. The new ways of reducing it were constantly being devised. Newspeak, indeed, differed from most other languages, in that its vocabulary grew smaller instead of larger every year. Each reduction was a gain. Since the smaller area of choice, the smaller the temptation to take thought. Ultimately, it was hoped to make articulate speak issue from the larynx without involving a higher brain centers at all. The aim was frankly admitted in the newspeak word duck speak, meaning to quack like a duck. Like various other words in the B vocabulary, duck speak was ambivalent in meaning. I said this earlier. You can have it positive or negative, provided that the opinions were quacked out were orthodox ones. It implied nothing but praise, and when the Times referred to one of the orators of the party as a double plus good duck speaker, it was paying a warm and valued compliment. The C is this the C one now? The C vocabulary was supplementary to the others and consisted entirely of scientific and technical terms. These resembled the scientific terms in use today. They were constructed from the same roots, but the usual care was taken to define them rigidly and strip them of undesirable meanings. They followed the same grammatical rules as the words in the other two vocabularies. Very few of the C words had any currency either in everyday speech or in political speech. Any scientific worker or technician could find all the words he needed in a list devoted to his own speciality, but he seldom had more than a smattering of words occurring in other lists. Ooh. It's about that big. It's just a little notepad. Only a very few words were common to all the lists, and there was no vocabulary expressing the function of science as a habit of mind, or a method of thought, irrespective of its particular branches. There was indeed no word for science, any meaning that it took, any meaning that it could possibly bear, being already sufficiently covered by the word Ingsoc. From the foregoing account, it will be seen that in newspeak the expression of unorthodox opinions above a very low level was well nigh impossible. It was, of course, possible to utter heresies of very crude kind, a species of blasphemy. Excuse me. It would have been possible, for example, to say Big Brother is ungood, but this sentiment, which to an orthodox ear merely conveyed a self-evident absurdity, could not have been sustained by reasoned argument, because the necessary words were not available. Bollocks. Ideas inimical to Ingsoc could only be entertained in a vague, wordless form, and could only be named in very broad terms, which lumped together and condemned whole groups of heresies without defining them in doing so. One could, in fact, only use newspeak for unorthodox purposes by illegitimately translating some of the words back into old speak. For example, all mans are equal was a possible newspeak sentence, but only in the same sense in which all men are red-haired is a possible old speak sentence. It did not contain a grammatical error, but it expressed a palpable untruth, i.e., all men are of equal size, weight, or strength. The concept of political equality no longer existed, and the secondary meaning had accordingly been purged out of the word equal. In 1984, when old speak was still the normal means of communication, the danger theoretically existed that in using newspeak words one might remember their original meanings. In practice, it was not difficult for any person well grounded in doublethink to avoid doing this, but within a couple of generations even the possibility of such a lapse would have vanished. A person growing up with newspeak as his sole language would no more know that equal had once had a secondary meaning of politically equal, or that free once had meant intellectually free. Then, for instance, a person who had never heard of chess would be aware of the secondary meanings attaching to queen and rook. There would be many crimes and errors which it would be beyond his power to commit, simply because they were nameless and therefore unimaginable, and it would be foreseen that with the passage of time the distinguishing characteristics of newspeak would become more and more pronounced, its words growing fewer and fewer, their meanings more and more rigid, and the chance of putting them to improper uses always diminishing. When old speak had been once and for all superseded, the last link with the past would have been severed. History had already been rewritten, but fragments of the literature of the past survived here and there, imperfectly censored, and so long as one retained one's knowledge of old speak, it was possible to read them. In the future, such fragments, even if they chanced to survive, would be unintelligible and untranslatable. It was impossible to translate any passage of old speak into newspeak, unless it either referred to some technical process or some very simple, everyday action. It was already orthodox. Good thinkful would be the newspeak expression. In tendency, in practice. In practice, this meant that no book written before approximately 1960 could be translated as a whole. Pre-revolutionary literature could only be subjected to ideological translation. This alteration in a sense as well as language, take for example the well-known passage from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Are you paying attention? I'm going to read this again. I know this isn't Declaration of Independence, but apparently the world seems to believe this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with a certain inalienable rights, meaning, no matter what, this has to happen. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you take any of that away from someone, you're a cunt. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Does that make sense? You put these people in charge and then you complain. So put better people in charge. Is it that difficult? That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it, and to institute a new government. I'm going to go through that one more time. Look at that, that's right there. I'm going to have a look at this one. Look at that, that's right there. You got to pay attention to that. Have you read the book? Can you see what's happening in the world? Read that. It would have been quite impossible to render this into newspeak while keeping the sense of the original. The nearest one could come to doing so would be to swallow the whole passage up in a single word, groundthink. Oh yeah, of course. A full translation could only be an ideological translation, whereby Jefferson's words would be changed into a panegyric on absolute government. Into a panegyric. A good deal of the literature of the past was indeed already being transformed in this way. Considerations of prestige made it desirable to preserve the memory of certain historical figures, while at the same time bringing their achievements into line with the philosophy of ingsoc. Various writers such as Shakespeare, Milton, Swift, Byron, Dickens, and some others were therefore in the process of translation when the task had been completed. Their original writings, with all else survived of the literature of the past, would be destroyed. These translations were a slow, difficult business, and it was not expected that they would be finished before the first or second decade of the 21st century. There were also large quantities of merely utilitarian literature, indispensable technical manuals, and the like, that had to be treated in the same way. It was chiefly in order to allow time for the preliminary work of translation that the final adoption of newspeak had been fixed for so late a day as 2050. Is that it? That's it. That's the book. There you go. Are you paying attention? That chapter 5 though. Oof, that one gets you. I do like that one. It's fun. Very fun. It's a shame nobody suggested any accents, but whatever. It'd have been fun. Ooh, I've got biscuits. Ooh. What now? Well, I'm done here. It's been 3 hours. I finally read it. I've done the thing. By the way, brilliant book. Gonna go watch the movie now.